Section 1. The Kid from Connecticut. Seth McFarland's origin. Close your eyes for a moment, or leave them open. Either way, let the words just wash over you. Tonight we are going to spend a long, slow, unhurried time together, drifting through one of the strangest and most fascinating stories in the entire history of American television. A story about a cartoon that should never have existed. A story about a creator who nearly died before he could see his greatest work succeed. A story about jokes that went too far, characters that lost themselves, ratings that crumbled, and a legacy that remains, even now, genuinely impossible to ignore. This is the dark side of Family Guy, but before we get to the darkness, we have to go back to the light, back to the very beginning. Back to a small town in Connecticut in the early 1970s, where a boy was growing up who would one day change the way America laughed, and then spend the next 2 decades wrestling with what that actually meant. Seth Woodbury McFarland was born on October 26, 1973, in Kent, Connecticut. Kent is one of those quintessentially New England towns that feels like it exists slightly outside of time. Rolling hills, old stone walls, the kind of quiet that settles over everything in winter like a second blanket. It had a population of just a few thousand people, and it was not, by any reasonable definition, the kind of place you would expect to produce one of the most commercially successful animators in television history. His father, Ronald Milton McFarland, was a teacher and admissions director. His mother, Ann Perry, taught at a private school. By every account, Seth was a child who arrived already wired differently from everyone around him. He was drawing recognizable cartoon characters at the age of 2, not scribbling, drawing. His parents noticed early that what he was doing wasn't the usual childhood art project. There was structure to it, intention, a sense of form that most children don't develop until years later. By the time he was 8 years old, he was writing and illustrating his own comic strip, which he called Walter Crouton. That strip ran, Amash Famille, and this is not a small detail, in his local Kent newspaper. A professionally published comic strip written and drawn by an 8-year-old boy. The strip ran for several years. Most children at that age are still figuring out how to read a newspaper, let alone produce content for one. His parents encouraged him without smothering him. They bought him books about animation. They let him watch cartoons with the kind of analytical freedom that most parents don't think to offer. He wasn't just watching cartoons, he was studying them. He was absorbing the timing of jokes, the structure of recurring gags, the way a well-placed pause could make something ordinary feel suddenly hilarious. He was doing all of this before he had the vocabulary to describe what he was doing. The influences he absorbed in those early years would be visible in his work for the rest of his career. He loved the Flintstones, not just for the jokes, but for the way it transplanted domestic sitcom logic into an absurd prehistoric setting. He loved All in the Family, and the way Archie Bunker could be simultaneously appalling and oddly sympathetic. He loved Mel Brooks. He loved the old Warner Brothers cartoons. He loved the irreverence of shows that seem to understand that comedy, at its best, is a little bit dangerous. But perhaps nothing shaped him more than Johnny Carson. McFarlane has spoken many times about sitting up late as a child, watching The Tonight Show, studying the rhythm of Carson's monologues, the way he handled a joke that didn't land, the elegant recovery, the slight raise of an eyebrow. Carson represented something to the young McFarlane that went beyond simple comedy. He represented a kind of mastery, the mastery of being in a room and knowing exactly how to fill it. When Seth was in his early teens, his family moved briefly, and he attended the Fenn School and then the Kent School, where he continued to develop his artistic abilities. Teachers noted that he was unusually focused for his age. He was not the kid who goofed off in class, or rather, he was exactly that kid, but his goofing off had a quality of precision to it. His jokes were constructed, his impressions were uncanny. He could do voices that stopped conversations. He was already, in some fundamental way, a performer. At 17, he applied to the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence. RISD, as it is universally known, is not a safety school. It is one of the most prestigious art and design institutions in the world, a place that has produced an extraordinary concentration of working artists, designers, and creative professionals. Getting in is genuinely difficult. Seth got in. He enrolled in the film animation program, and what happened there would change everything. Providence in the early 1990s was a particular kind of place. The city had been through hard times economically, but it had that quality that struggling post-industrial cities sometimes develop. A rich, slightly underground creative culture. A sense that interesting things were happening just slightly off the main path. For a young man who had grown up in the particular quiet of small-town Connecticut, it was revelatory. At RISD, McFarland flourished in the way that genuinely talented people sometimes do when they are finally around other genuinely talented people. The competition pushed him. The environment gave him permission to be strange. He made friends who challenged him. He developed the work ethic that would later allow him to produce, write, direct, and voice act for multiple television series simultaneously. A schedule that most people in the industry still find almost incomprehensible. His senior thesis film was called The Life of Larry, and this is where the story really begins. The Life of Larry was a short animated film, just a few minutes long, about a lazy, lovable, slightly dim but fundamentally good-hearted middle-aged man named Larry and his talking dog Steve. Larry had a wife, he had a beer, he had a recliner. He had a peculiar relationship with the world that was warm on the outside and slightly melancholy on the inside. He made jokes that were a little sharper than they first appeared. Steve the dog was, in many ways, more emotionally sophisticated than Larry, a dynamic that would echo through McFarlane's work for the next 30 years. The film was good enough to earn McFarlane a job. Hanna-Barbera, the legendary animation studio responsible for The Flintstones, Yogi Bear, Scooby-Doo, and dozens of other cultural touchstones, hired him right out of school. He moved to Los Angeles. He was 22 years old, and he was already working in the industry he had been studying since he could hold a pencil. At Hanna-Barbera, McFarlane worked on shows like Johnny Bravo and Dexter's Laboratory. He was a writer and storyboard artist, and he was very good at his job. But he was also, during those years, continuing to develop the ideas that had begun with The Life of Larry. He made a second short called Larry and Steve, which aired as part of a Cartoon Network anthology series. People noticed. The right people noticed. Those shorts are genuinely worth paying attention to because if you watch them today, you can see exactly what Family Guy would eventually become. And you can also see what Family Guy started as. Larry and Steve had warmth. They had genuine affection between characters. The humor was absurd and irreverent, but it wasn't cruel. There was something fundamentally humane about the way McFarlane constructed those early relationships, even when the jokes were at someone's expense. A Cartoon Network executive saw the shorts and encouraged McFarlane to develop a full series pitch. He went away and worked. What came back was not exactly Larry and Steve anymore. Larry had become Peter Griffin. Louder, more physically broad, more explicitly working class. Steve the dog had become Brian, more articulate, more neurotic, more openly disappointed in himself. The wife had become Lois, patient, capable, quietly exhausted. The supporting world had expanded. A dim but lovable neighbor named Quagmire, a twitchy conspiracy theorist named Joe Swanson, and a baby named Stewie who harbored ambitions of world domination and spoke in a clipped, aristocratic accent that suggested he had somehow absorbed a complete Oxford education in utero. He pitched the show to several networks. Fox was interested. More than interested. A Fox executive named Marta Klein saw the pitch and responded to it immediately. McFarlane was offered a development deal that included a budget of approximately $50,000 to produce a more polished pilot presentation. He made it. And Fox, having watched it, ordered a full series. Seth MacFarlane was 24 years old. He had a show on Fox. He had created every major character. He was writing. He was voicing Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire himself. He was directing. He was the showrunner. He was, by any reasonable measure, doing the work of 5 people simultaneously, and he was doing all of it with a kind of energetic precision that people who worked with him in those early years still talk about with a mixture of admiration and mild exhaustion. The show was called Family Guy. It was scheduled to premiere on January 31st, 1999, in the coveted post-Super Bowl time slot, one of the most watched broadcast moments in American television. a slot that had launched shows like The Simpsons to cultural dominance. Fox believed in it enough to put it there. The night before it aired, Seth MacFarlane was 25 years old, living in Los Angeles, about to have his creation seen by somewhere between 20 and 25 million people. He had spent the last 3 years building something from scratch. He had done it with the kind of focus that leaves very little room for anything else. What he could not have known that night, what no one around him could have known, was that the story of Family Guy was not going to be a simple success story. It was going to be something stranger and more complicated than that. It was going to be canceled. It was going to be brought back from the dead. It was going to conquer the ratings. It was going to slowly lose its way. It was going to make Seth MacFarlane one of the most powerful people in Hollywood, and then it was going to become something he publicly admitted he no longer fully recognized. But on the night of January 30th, 1999, none of that had happened yet. The show was just about to begin. And so, in this quiet hour, let's begin too. If you're finding this relaxing and want to hear more stories like this one, long, slow, detailed journeys through the hidden histories of the things we grew up watching, please consider leaving a comment below and subscribing. It genuinely helps more than you might think, and it means these kinds of deep dives can keep happening. Now let's continue. Section 2. The show that almost never was. Pilots, Fox, and the first cancellation. There is something worth sitting with for a moment, in this quiet space between waking and sleeping, about the nature of television pilots. A pilot is a strange document. It is simultaneously a promise and an audition. It says, here is what this show could be. Here is the world, and here are the people in it, and here is the quality of attention we intend to bring. But it is also always incomplete. The best pilots in television history, the ones that launched genuinely great shows, are almost never the best episodes of those shows. They are rough sketches. They are first drafts of places that will eventually become deeply familiar. The Family Guy pilot episode, which aired on January 31st, 1999, after Super Bowl 33, was called Death Has a Shadow. The premise was simple. Peter Griffin, a large, bespectacled, enthusiastically dim factory worker in the fictional Rhode Island town of his neighborhood, loses his job after showing up to work drunk following a poker night with his friends. He applies for welfare, and through a clerical error receives a check for $150,000 a week instead of the $150 he was supposed to receive. Rather than report the error, Peter spends the money, with the particular short-sightedness of a man who has never had money and does not fully believe the situation is real. Things escalate. His wife Lois finds out. Chaos ensues. The resolution involves Peter throwing the money from a blimp over a football stadium, which means he has to go to prison. But the charges are then dismissed because Peter's baby, Stewie, appears to publicly forgive him, and a jury of football fans is not in the mood to convict a man whose infant son is endorsing him. It is a silly plot. It is not a particularly elegant pilot episode, but 22 million people watched it because 22 million people had just watched the Super Bowl and didn't turn off their televisions. Fox was delighted. The reviews were mixed but present. Television critics noticed the show, which was more than could be said for most new animated series. What the critics noticed, almost universally, was the comparison to The Simpsons. This comparison was, from the very beginning, both completely understandable and deeply irritating to everyone associated with Family Guy. The show shared a basic structural DNA. Working-class family, lovable oaf husband, capable and patient wife, children who represented different registers of dysfunction. Both were animated. Both aired on Fox. Both used the domestic family unit as a lens through which to examine American culture with a degree of irreverence that live-action television found difficult to sustain. But there were meaningful differences, even in those early episodes. The Simpsons, at its best, was a show about a family that genuinely loved each other in ways they couldn't always articulate. Its humor was warm even when it was sharp. Springfield felt like a place with a history and a logic. The characters, however absurd their behavior, had interiority. You felt like you understood why Homer did the things Homer did, why Bart acted out, why Lisa felt isolated, why Marge kept the whole operation together with a level of patient determination that occasionally cracked to reveal something deeper and more complicated underneath. Family Guy was doing something related but distinct. The Griffin family had warmth too, but it was a different kind of warmth. It was less stable. The jokes cut in different directions. Where The Simpsons tended to pull its punches at the last moment to let its characters off the hook in ways that preserved their basic dignity, Family Guy was more willing to let its characters suffer, to let the joke be at the expense of the person you were supposed to sympathize with, to hold a moment of discomfort a beat too long. The cutaway gag, a technique that would come to define the show, was present from the beginning, and in those early seasons, it was deployed with something that can only be called precision. Peter would say something like, "This reminds me of the time I..." And the show would cut to a brief, absurdist scene that had no narrative connection to the episode's plot, but that revealed something about the internal logic of the world, or about Peter's particular way of experiencing reality before cutting back. The jokes in those early cutaways were often genuinely surprising. They had a quality of controlled non sequitur. They felt random in the best way, which is to say they felt like the work of someone who had thought very carefully about how to seem spontaneous. The first season ran from January to May of 1999. 14 episodes. The ratings were inconsistent. The post-Super Bowl premiere had been watched by 22 million people, but subsequent episodes pulled somewhere between 8 and 11 million. Decent numbers, but not the kind of dominance that Fox had hoped the Super Bowl boost would translate into. The critical reception remained mixed. Some reviewers appreciated the show's energy and its willingness to be genuinely weird. Others found it derivative of The Simpsons and cruder without being funnier. Fox renewed the show for a second season and then a third. The numbers didn't improve dramatically, but they held. The show found its audience, mostly younger viewers, mostly male, mostly the kind of person who watched television late at night and wanted something that didn't ask much of them, except a willingness to laugh at things that were slightly uncomfortable. During the second and third seasons, the show began to develop a voice that was more distinctly its own. The characters deepened slightly. Brian's melancholy became more textured. He was a dog who wanted desperately to be a human intellectual, who wrote bad novels and ordered martinis and held himself to standards he consistently failed to meet. And this gap between aspiration and reality was played with a kind of comic tenderness that suggested the writers understood something genuine about the pain of that particular condition. Stewie's villainous monologues became more elaborate and more funny. The joke was no longer simply that a baby had sinister ambitions, but that the baby's ambitions were expressed in a specific register of theatrical grandiosity that gave even the darkest statements an air of almost operatic absurdity. Meg, the eldest Griffin daughter, was already being used as the show's punching bag, though in these early seasons the punishment was milder and more recognizably rooted in the ordinary humiliations of teenage girlhood. Awkwardness, invisibility, the particular loneliness of being the uncool one in a family of people who are each strange in their own ways. The cruelty toward Meg in those early seasons had a quality of affectionate exasperation rather than the more systematic contempt that would develop later. Chris, the middle Griffin child, was perhaps the least developed of the main characters. Broad, goofy, intermittently perceptive in ways that surprised even the writers. A vessel for a certain kind of absurdist physical comedy that didn't require much psychology but landed reliably. Lois was doing something interesting in those early seasons that deserves more attention than it usually gets. She was clearly the most competent person in her family, the one holding everything together, but she wasn't simply a saint or a doormat. She had appetites and desires that were her own. She had a complicated relationship with her own attractiveness and her own youth, which she saw receding in the particular way that people see things receding when they're not sure they made exactly the right choices. She had her own darkness, her own capacity for moral compromise. In the early seasons, the writers were still interested in developing that complexity. And then, in the spring of 2000, Fox canceled the show. The cancellation came after the second season. The numbers had not been strong enough to justify the expense of the show's production. Animation is expensive, more expensive than most live-action television. And a show that was pulling 8 to 9 million viewers was not the kind of hit Fox needed to keep paying those bills. The announcement was made with the kind of corporate briskness that characterizes network decisions about creative properties. The show was done. The cast and crew were thanked. The production wrapped. Seth McFarland was 26 years old. His show had been canceled. He had spent 2 years, his mid-20s, the years when a creative person is often doing some of their most important developmental work, pouring himself into Family Guy, and Fox had decided it wasn't worth continuing. The show was in limbo for about a year. Fox had 35 completed episodes that had never aired, a third season that had been produced before the cancellation decision came down. There were negotiations about what to do with them. Eventually, Fox aired the remaining episodes across the summer and fall of 2001. The ratings for those unaired episodes were, in some cases, better than anything the show had done during its original run. People who had discovered the show through reruns were finding it with an enthusiasm that felt, to the network, slightly puzzling. But it wasn't enough to reverse the cancellation. As 2002 arrived, Family Guy was officially dead. Seth MacFarlane went back to development work. He started developing a new show, a spy parody that would eventually become American Dad, though it was still years away from production. He worked. He kept working. The world, in the form of the Cartoon Network's late-night Adult Swim block, was about to do something unexpected. Adult Swim had begun in 2001 as a programming block on Cartoon Network, airing between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. It was designed for adult viewers who remembered Saturday morning cartoons and wanted something that scratched a similar itch without condescending to their adult sensibilities. The programming was irreverent, experimental, occasionally brilliant, and produced on budgets that would make most network executives wince. It was the kind of programming block that exists because someone at the network had a specific vision and the institutional freedom to pursue it. Adult Swim acquired the rights to air Family Guy reruns beginning in 2003. The results were startling. The show's ratings on Adult Swim climbed steadily and then dramatically. The audience that had found the show on Fox in its original run was now supplemented by an entirely new generation of viewers who were encountering it for the first time. Viewers who were, in many cases, younger and who found the show's particular register of irreverence genuinely exciting in a way that mainstream network television rarely managed. By 2004, Family Guy reruns on Adult Swim were drawing audiences that, in some cases, exceeded 4 million viewers per episode, a remarkable number for a late-night cable rerun of a canceled show. The DVD releases were selling with an urgency that surprised even optimistic projections. The first volume of Family Guy DVDs sold more than 400,000 copies in its first month of release, a number that, at the time, was essentially unprecedented for an animated television series that was no longer in production. Fox, watching these numbers with a mixture of surprise and commercial interest, began to reconsider. The network that had canceled Family Guy was now looking at evidence that a substantial audience existed, an audience that had not been fully captured during the show's original run, but that was demonstrably present and demonstrably passionate. In 2004, Fox announced that Family Guy was uncanceled. It would return for a fourth season. Seth MacFarlane, who had quietly never stopped working on the show's mythology even during the cancellation years, would be back as showrunner. It was an almost unprecedented event in American television. Shows that were canceled simply didn't come back. The economics of television production didn't usually allow for it. The cast moved on, the production infrastructure dissolved. The network scheduled other shows in the time slot. The Family Guy revival was, at the time, genuinely remarkable. It was a story about the power of an audience that refused to let go. But as we will see as we drift further into this story together, the revival was also the beginning of something that would take years to fully understand. Because the show that came back in 2005 was not quite the same show that had been canceled in 2000. It had changed. The world had changed. And the changes would compound over the seasons in ways that were subtle at first, and then less subtle, and then eventually impossible to ignore. The lights go down a little further. The story gets a little darker. But we are only at the beginning. Section 3. Death, DVD sales, and the miracle revival. There is a particular quality to the years that something spends in limbo. Not quite dead, not quite alive. Suspended. The people who made it carrying it with them like a story they aren't sure they're allowed to finish. Seth MacFarlane, in the years between Family Guy's cancellation and its eventual revival, was building other things. He was developing the project that would become American Dad. He was working. But Family Guy never fully left him. Not creatively, not emotionally, not commercially. The show was still out there in the world, accumulating something that the television industry had not yet developed adequate language to describe. A fan base that existed primarily downstream of the original broadcast. People who had found the show through reruns and tapes and early internet file sharing. People who loved it with an intensity that first-run audiences had never quite managed to generate. This is worth pausing on because it tells us something important about what Family Guy actually was in its original form. When the show first aired on Fox, it had been received as a reasonably entertaining, but not essential animated comedy. The critical establishment found it derivative. The ratings were decent, but not spectacular. The network canceled it twice. By the conventional metrics of broadcast television success, Family Guy had not been a hit. And yet something had lodged in the culture. Something about the show's particular energy, its rhythms, its willingness to go to places that The Simpsons wouldn't, its cutaway structure that rewarded a certain kind of attentiveness, its characters who felt both broadly drawn and specifically recognizable. Something had connected with viewers in a way that the ratings numbers had never adequately captured. The DVD releases are part of this story, and they deserve more attention than they typically receive in accounts of the Family Guy revival. The first volume of Family Guy DVDs was released in April 2003, while the show was still canceled and while Adult Swim reruns were building the audience that would eventually demand its return. That first volume sold 400,000 copies in its first month. By the end of 2003, it had sold over 2 million copies, making it one of the best-selling television DVD releases in history at that point. The second volume, released later that year, performed similarly. These numbers were not just commercially significant, they were socially significant. They were people going to stores, buy. This was 2003, so actual physical stores, and deliberately spending money to own a show that was no longer on the air. They were lending the DVDs to friends. They were watching episodes repeatedly. They were not passive consumers of a product. They were active advocates for a work of art they felt had been treated unjustly by the network system that was supposed to serve it. Seth MacFarlane watched these numbers develop. Fox watched these numbers develop. The Adult Swim ratings continued to climb. By early 2004, the situation had become strange enough that it demanded a response. Fox began discussions about what a revival might look like, what it would cost, whether the original creative team could be reassembled, whether the audiences who had fallen in love with the show through reruns and DVDs would show up for new episodes. The announcement of the revival came in the spring of 2004. Family Guy would return for a fourth season in 2005. Seth MacFarlane would return as showrunner. The voice cast: Seth MacFarlane himself, Alex Borstein, Seth Green, Mila Kunis, and Mike Henry would return. The production infrastructure would be rebuilt. The show would pick up more or less where it had left off, though 3 years of real-world time had passed and the world into which it was returning was different from the one it had left. The fourth season premiere, North by North Quahog, aired on May 1st, 2005. It was watched by 11.85 million viewers, more than anything the show had achieved during its original run, and a clear demonstration that the rerun and DVD audiences had indeed converted into live viewers for new episodes. The episode was about Peter and Lois trying to rekindle their marriage on a road trip, and it was broadly well received. Funny, confident, glad to be back, with the slightly heightened energy of something that knows it has been given a second chance. The critical reception of the revival season was interesting. Reviewers who had been lukewarm about the show in its original run were now more engaged, partly because the show's survival had become a story in itself. The fact that Family Guy had been canceled and brought back by audience demand gave it a cultural resonance that its original run had lacked. It was now an underdog story. It was now the show that the fans had saved. And there is something in human psychology that makes us root for things that have been saved, that makes us more generous with them, more willing to find their virtues. But if you watch the fourth season carefully, and in this quiet hour, I am inviting you to just imagine it, to let the visual run through your mind the way a half-remembered dream surfaces and then dissolves. If you watch it carefully, you can begin to see something changing. The thing that's changing is small at first. It is a matter of proportion. The show that came back in 2005 was the same show in most of the ways that mattered. Same characters, same voice cast, same basic setting, same essential premise. But something in the balance had shifted. The cutaway gags were slightly more frequent. The emotional through lines of episodes were slightly thinner. The jokes that had once been deployed with precision were now being deployed with volume. Not always more of them, exactly, but the gaps between them had shortened. The space that had once allowed the characters to breathe and reveal themselves was now more consistently occupied by the next joke, the next riff, the next reference. This is a subtle thing, and it would be unfair to overstate it in the context of the fourth season specifically. The fourth season still contained episodes that were as good as anything the show had done in its original run. The Cleveland Loretta Quagmire, which dealt with an unexpected infidelity storyline, had genuine emotional weight. Petarded was a broadly funny but not entirely thoughtless episode about Peter's apparent low IQ. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Fawns, which introduced the Griffin family's adoption of a new religion based on the Fawns from Happy Days, was the kind of sustained, absurdist premise that the show had always done well when it committed to one. But the seeds of something were there. The writer's room had expanded, the production schedule had tightened. The show's success in syndication and on DVD had created a demand for new episodes that needed to be met consistently. And consistency in television production has a way of working against the kind of careful, unhurried comedy construction that had characterized the best moments of the original run. Seth MacFarlane, in those post-revival years, was also dealing with the particular challenge of being a showrunner who was simultaneously operating in several other professional registers. He was developing American Dad, which premiered on Fox just 2 weeks after the Family Guy revival on May 1st, 2005, the same night as the Family Guy premiere, which remains one of the more audacious programming decisions in the history of animated television. He was working on a theatrical film. He was doing voice work. He was, by anyone's reasonable estimation, stretched. The fifth season, which aired in 2006 and 2007, was when the tonal shift became more clearly visible. Not in every episode. There were still genuinely brilliant moments scattered throughout the season. But the center of gravity had moved. Peter Griffin's behavior was becoming less the behavior of a man who was well-intentioned, but catastrophically limited in his understanding of consequences, and more the behavior of a man who was simply cruel, simply selfish, simply not interested in the welfare of the people around him. The distinction matters. A character who causes harm through ignorance generates a different kind of comedy and a different kind of audience relationship than a character who causes harm through indifference or malice. The show was also beginning to develop what would become its most controversial tendency: the extended, repeated, deliberately prolonged gag. The joke that goes on for 30 seconds, the joke that goes on for a minute, the joke that goes on until it has generated a different kind of laughter, not the laughter of surprise or recognition, but the laughter of sustained discomfort, the laughter that comes from watching something refuse to end when it should. This is a legitimate comedic technique, and in the hands of writers who understand its limits, it can be brilliant. But it requires a very specific kind of trust between the show and its audience, a trust that the show knows what it's doing, that the length has a purpose, that the discomfort is generating something beyond simple duration. That trust was still mostly present in the fifth season. It would not always remain so. The revival had been a miracle. The numbers were undeniable. The audience was in Yanet. The show was a cultural force in a way it had never quite been during its original run. Fox was happy. Seth MacFarlane was, by most outward appearances, in exactly the position he had been working toward since he was a child, drawing comics for a Connecticut newspaper. But the miracle had its price. Revivals always do. When you bring something back from the dead, it comes back as itself. But it also comes back as the idea of itself. It comes back carrying the weight of everything people loved about it, everything they imagined it to be during the years it was absent. And that weight is very, very heavy. Heavy enough sometimes to bend the thing out of shape entirely. We are still in the early stages of the bending. The real distortion is still to come. But close your eyes for just a moment if they aren't already closed. Feel the warmth of the early seasons. The genuinely funny dog and his genuinely lovable, genuinely foolish human family. The weird baby with the British accent and the death ray. The neighbor who couldn't stop laughing. the other neighbor who was paralyzed but refused to let that stop him. The town that felt, at its best, like a place where anything could happen. Hold that image for a moment, because in the sections that follow, we are going to watch it change. Section 4. The Golden Years and the First Cracks. Every long-running television show has a period that fans will eventually identify as the Golden Era. That period is rarely recognized as such while it is happening. It is only visible in retrospect when you can look back at a particular stretch of seasons and see the combination of factors that made them work. The right writers in the room, the right level of creative ambition, the right balance between the show's identity and its willingness to evolve, the right level of network faith that permits risk-taking. The golden era of Family Guy is generally placed by fans and critics somewhere between the latter part of the original run and the first couple of seasons of the revival, roughly seasons 3 through 6, with certain episodes from surrounding seasons included, depending on who you ask. Let us dwell here for a while in the warmth of what the show was doing right, before we move into the harder territory. Let's take our time with this. Season 3 of the original run, the season that Fox had actually produced before canceling the show, which then aired in scattered fashion during the summer and fall of 2001, contained some of the most fully realized work the show ever did. Road to Rhode Island, the episode that established the Road to format, a series of travel-based adventures featuring Brian and Stewie that deliberately evoked the old Bob Hope and Bing Crosby road movies, was a revelation. It demonstrated that the show could do something beyond the episodic sitcom structure it had been using, that it could sustain a longer narrative with genuine character development, that Brian and Stewie as a comedic pair were capable of generating chemistry that was more emotionally complex than anything the main family storylines were producing. In Road to Rhode Island, Brian and Stewie are stranded and have to travel across the country together to get home. What could have been a simple vehicle for jokes becomes, in the best parts of the episode, something genuinely touching. A story about two characters who are both, in their different ways, deeply lonely, and who find in each other a companionship that neither of them has words for. The episode contains a musical number in which Brian processes grief about his mother with a candor and rawness that is startling in the context of a show that usually keeps its emotional cards very close. There is a moment near the end of that number where the animation slows and the joke falls away entirely for just a beat. And what you are left with is something that functions as genuine feeling. That moment is not an accident. It is the work of writers who understood that the funniest comedy is often comedy that has a relationship with sadness. One If by Clam, Two If by Sea, another third season episode, gave the Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and his friends spent most of their social lives, to a group of British expats. This is a premise that could have been merely joke delivery, and it was that, but it was also something else. A story about belonging, about the ways that men use communal spaces to construct identity, about what it means when a place that represents your sense of yourself is taken away from you. None of this is stated explicitly. The show does not break from its comedy register to announce what it is doing, but it is doing it. You can feel it in the construction of the scenes, in the way Peter's distress is played with more specificity than mere petulance, in the way the resolution, Peter and his friends reclaiming their bar, lands with something more than narrative tidiness. Chitty Chitty Death Bang gave us Stewie's relationship with his former cult membership, of all things, and managed to make a baby's past involvement with a violent doomsday cult feel both absurd and oddly logical within the internal universe of the character. Da Boom, the Millennium Y2K episode, was one of the most ambitious single-episode stories the show had attempted. A full post-apocalyptic narrative that gave every major character something to do and managed to sustain its premise for the entire runtime without losing energy. The fourth season of the revival, as we've discussed, retained much of this quality while showing the first signs of what was to come. But seasons 5 and 6 were still, in many ways, operating at a high level. Stewie Loves Lois, from season 5, used Stewie's sudden, unexpected attachment to his mother as a vehicle for exploring the psychology of maternal bonding with enough sincerity to be genuinely funny. Patriot Games, which sent Peter to the NFL, had the kind of escalating comedic structure that the show had always done well. Prick Up Your Ears, which took on abstinence education, managed to be both pointed social commentary and legitimately funny, without the commentary overwhelming the comedy. There was also, during these years, a genuine sophistication in the show's construction of its secondary characters. Joe Swanson, the wheelchair-using police officer neighbor, was more dimensional in these seasons than he would later become. A man dealing with a profound physical limitation who was not defined entirely by that limitation, who had an active inner life, ambitions, frustrations, a marriage that was doing its own complicated work. Quagmire, the hypersexual neighbor, was at this point still being written with enough self-awareness to make his predatory qualities function as a commentary on a particular type of masculine performance, rather than simply an endorsement of it. The writer's room in these seasons contained a concentration of talent that deserves acknowledgement. David Zuckerman, who had been part of the original run and had helped establish the show's voice, had moved on to other projects, but the room had developed a collective muscle memory for the show's rhythms. Mark Henneman was a significant presence. Alex Borstein, who voiced Lois, contributed to the writing as well. The room had the quality that good writers' rooms have, an ability to argue about whether something was funny without making those arguments personal, an institutional knowledge of the characters deep enough to catch when a joke required a character to behave in ways inconsistent with established personality, a willingness to throw out work that wasn't landing even when that work had taken days to produce. But cracks were developing, and the cracks had structural causes that went beyond any individual creative decision. The first structural cause was the pace of production. A network animated series typically produces between 20 and 22 episodes per season. Each episode of Family Guy takes, in production terms, approximately 9 to 12 months from writing to animation to final delivery. This means that at any given moment, the production is simultaneously working on episodes from multiple different points in that pipeline. Some episodes are in the writing stage, some are in voice recording, some are in animation, some are in post-production. The creative team is constantly working on things that won't be seen for the better part of a year. This production pace creates a specific kind of pressure on a writer's room. The need for content is relentless and unforgiving. Good ideas cannot be waited for. They have to be generated on schedule, in sufficient volume to keep the pipeline full. The natural result of this pressure is that quality control becomes harder to maintain consistently. An episode that isn't quite working gets made anyway, because there isn't time to start over. A joke that is almost funny gets used because the alternative is a gap in the script. The writer's room that, in the early seasons, could afford to discard weak material and wait for stronger ideas, was now operating under constraints that made that discernment harder to apply consistently. The second structural cause was the expansion of the writer's room itself. As the show grew and its production demands increased, the room expanded to accommodate more writers. This is a normal feature of successful television production. More writers means more output means more episodes. But expanding a writer's room changes its dynamics in ways that are not always beneficial. The institutional knowledge becomes harder to maintain. The collective voice becomes harder to keep consistent. New writers bring new sensibilities, and those sensibilities are not always compatible with what the show had established. In Family Guy's case, there is some evidence that the writers who joined during the revival era had a somewhat different relationship to the characters than the writers who had been there from the beginning. The original writers had developed the characters gradually, had argued about their personalities and limitations, had built up a shared understanding of what these people were and weren't capable of. New writers coming in from outside worked from the characters as they existed on screen, characters who were already slightly simplified from their original conceptions, already more broadly defined. The result was a feedback loop in which each new wave of writers inherited a slightly more reduced version of the characters and wrote that reduced version, making the next wave's inherited version slightly more reduced still. This process is what critics and fans generally call Flanderization, named after Ned Flanders from The Simpsons, whose original characterization as a slightly too enthusiastic but genuinely decent neighbor gradually reduced, over years of the show's run, to a parody of religious zealotry that retained almost none of the original character's humanity. The term has become a standard piece of vocabulary in discussions of long-running animated series, and Family Guy would eventually provide some of the most discussed examples of the phenomenon in television history. But in the golden years, in those seasons 5 and 6 where the show was still mostly doing justice to its characters, while the cracks were forming but not yet fully visible, there was still something worth cherishing. There was a show that, at its best, understood that comedy is a serious business, that understood the craft of timing and construction and character and world building, that occasionally produced something genuinely moving, genuine in its understanding of human loneliness and connection, and the gap between who people want to be and who they actually are. The show's single greatest achievement may be the episode Brian and Stewie from Season 8, though we are getting ahead of ourselves temporally, in which Brian and Stewie are locked in a bank vault over a weekend and simply talk to each other. No cutaways, no plot, no supporting characters. Just two characters in a confined space having a conversation that become, over the episode's runtime, increasingly raw and increasingly real. Brian reveals his suicidal ideation. Stewie reveals, beneath all his grandiloquent villainy, something that functions as genuine love. The love of a child for the person who, in a strange and unconventional way, has been the most consistent presence in his life. The episode is remarkable not because of what it does with the show's comedy, but because of what it reveals about the emotional architecture that had been built over 8 seasons. Architecture that the show's weaker episodes had repeatedly failed to honor, but that had somehow remained structurally intact beneath the failure. That episode is the golden era in concentrated form. It is the show proving in the middle of a period when its critics had largely written it off as a machine for producing offensive gags, that it still knew what its characters were. That underneath all the cutaways and the cruelty and the noise, there was still something with a genuine pulse. But the cracks were widening, and as Season 6 became Season 7, and Season 7 became Season 8, the things that were pulling the show away from its best self became harder to ignore. The comedy became louder. The cruelty became more systematic. The character of Peter Griffin began a transformation that would take him from lovable oaf to something significantly less lovable. And that transformation is where our story gets darker. Section 5. Peter Griffin's slow transformation into something darker. Let's talk about Peter Griffin. In this late and quiet hour, let's really talk about him. Because Peter Griffin is the center of Family Guy in the way that a black hole is the center of a galaxy. Everything orbits around him. Everything is defined in relation to him. And the closer you look at him, the more the light bends. He is, depending on which seasons you are watching and which particular episode you have landed on, simultaneously one of the funniest characters in animated television history and one of the most troubling. The version of Peter Griffin that existed in the early seasons of the show, the version that Seth McFarland wrote from the inside in the years when he was still thinking carefully about who this person was a specific type of man that American culture has always found both funny and poignant. Peter was working class in a way that felt genuine rather than performed. He worked at a brewery. He bowled. He drank beer with his neighbors. He watched too much television. He had enthusiasms that were childlike in their intensity and completely divorced from any practical consideration. He might become obsessed with a toy or a movie or a song, with the full-body, unreserved passion that most adults have learned to suppress. And this quality was played as endearing, as a form of innocence that survived in him, where it had died in most people. But Peter was also and this is the part that gets less attention in the general celebration of the early seasons, genuinely loving. Not in an articulate way. Not in a way he could have explained or defended or produced evidence for on demand. But in the specific, physical, unthinking way that certain people demonstrate love. Through presence, through an instinct to be in the room when it matters, through occasional moments of insight that seem to come from somewhere deeper than his intellect usually operates. He loved Lois. He loved his children. When the show remembered that he loved them, the love was real. There is an early episode in which Peter, having gotten into a series of escalating conflicts with a giant chicken named Ernie, a recurring antagonist whose grudge against Peter begins over an expired coupon, finally confronts him in a battle that tears through the city. These battles are played entirely straight, with the scale and violence of an action movie, and they are genuinely hilarious because of that commitment. But what is easy to miss in the visual spectacle of those scenes is the way they function as a release valve. Peter's violence toward the chicken is not random or gratuitous. It is the exteriorization of the frustrations of a specific kind of man, a man whose life has not given him many avenues for triumph, who takes an almost absurd level of satisfaction in physical conflict with a literal giant bird, because the giant bird is one of the few things in his world that he can beat. That psychological logic, the logic that connected Peter's absurd behavior to a recognizable human experience, was the engine of the early show. You didn't have to be Peter Griffin to understand why Peter Griffin did the things he did. You didn't have to be working class or dim or from Rhode Island. You just had to have felt at some point the specific frustration of being someone whose inner life is richer than the world around them gives them credit for. Someone who expresses love clumsily and feels ignored. Someone who occasionally abandons good sense entirely in favor of something that simply feels good in the moment. The transformation that Peter underwent over the middle and later seasons of the show is not something that happened in a single episode or even a single season. It was gradual. It was incremental. It happened 1 degree at a time over years of production, and the people making the show may not have been fully aware it was happening while it was. What changed was the relationship between Peter's behavior and his consequences. In the early seasons, Peter's follies generally resulted in negative consequences for Peter. He embarrassed himself. He got hurt. The joke, fundamentally, was on him. This is a structurally important distinction, because comedy about a character who suffers the consequences of his own stupidity is comedy that invites sympathy. We laugh with Peter because we recognize that he is, in some sense, the victim of his own limitations. But over the later seasons, Peter's behavior increasingly resulted in negative consequences for the people around him, rather than for Peter himself. He hurt Lois. He dismissed his children. He treated his neighbor Cleveland with a casualness that shaded from friendly insensitivity into something harder to excuse. And he often faced no consequences for any of it. The show reset between episodes. His family continued to love him and live with him. The world did not hold him accountable. This shift matters because it changes the nature of the comedy. Comedy in which a foolish person hurts themselves is comedy about the human condition. Comedy in which a foolish person consistently hurts others without consequence is something else. Something that requires the audience to simply find cruelty funny in itself, stripped of the psychological logic that gave the earlier comedy its texture. There is a category of Peter behavior in the later seasons that critics and fans have discussed extensively, and it centers on his relationship with Meg. We will talk about Meg in much more detail in a later section. But for now, Peter's cruelty toward his eldest daughter became, over time, one of the defining features of the show's later identity. It started as the kind of gentle mockery that families deploy toward the member who doesn't quite fit. Affectionate in its way, exasperated in its way, rooted in recognition that Meg was unusual and that unusual things get teased. It became something systematic and much harder to defend. Peter hitting Meg became a recurring gag. Peter actively expressing that he did not care about Meg's well-being became a recurring gag. The show eventually produced an episode, Seahorse Seashell Party, from season 10, in which Meg confronts her family's treatment of her in an explicitly emotional monologue, and then retracts everything she has said because the episode decides that Meg functions as a lightning rod for the family's dysfunction, absorbing abuse so that the others can function. This is one of the most debated episodes in the show's history, and we will spend considerable time with it later. The Flanderization of Peter also extended to his relationship with intelligence. In the early seasons, Peter was not smart, but he was not consistently portrayed as clinically unintelligent either. He had moments of genuine practical wisdom. He could be surprised. He learned occasionally from experience. The specific IQ episode from season 4, Petarded, which established that Peter had an IQ below the threshold for intellectual disability, was played partly for comedy but was also played with some sensitivity. Peter's experience of suddenly understanding himself as a person with a disability was treated as genuinely disorienting, and Lois's response to it was warm rather than dismissive. But as the seasons progressed, Peter's stupidity was played more broadly, more consistently, and with less interest in the psychological reality of what it would mean to be the person Peter appeared to be. He became stupid in the sense of being simply inconsistent, sometimes capable of complex scheming, sometimes incapable of understanding information that a young child would grasp, with the level of intelligence shifting to serve whatever the joke required at any given moment, rather than remaining coherent as a character trait. The violence in Peter's characterization also escalated in ways that are uncomfortable to trace. Physical comedy has always been part of Peter's character. His clumsiness, his willingness to participate in physical conflict with people and animals and inanimate objects are all established from the beginning. But the later seasons began to push Peter's violence toward his family into territory that the early seasons would not have visited. There are scenes in the later seasons in which Peter's behavior toward Lois, toward his children, and toward his neighbors functions less as physical comedy, and more as something that would be identifiable as domestic abuse if the show's comic frame were removed. This is not a claim that Family Guy was deliberately endorsing domestic violence. It is a claim that the show's reliance on the comic frame, the assumption that the comedy register excused the content within it, eventually began to strain against a limit that the show didn't fully acknowledge. The question of where the line is between played for comedy and normalized as acceptable behavior is one that long-running comedy shows frequently have to navigate, and Family Guy's navigation of it became increasingly poor as the seasons accumulated. There was also the matter of Peter's relationship with sexuality and with women in general. Glenn Quagmire's hypersexuality had always been one of the show's more contentious elements, but Quagmire was at least written, in the early seasons, with some degree of self-awareness about his own dysfunction. Peter's treatment of Lois, and the show's treatment of women in general, became progressively more retrograde as the series continued, in ways that went beyond simple comedic exaggeration into something that felt less examined. What makes all of this particularly interesting and particularly sad is that the raw material for a much better version of Peter Griffin never went away. It persisted in scattered episodes throughout the later seasons as a reminder of what the character had been. When the show chose to engage with Peter's genuine love for Lois, not as the butt of a joke, not as a setup for humiliation, but as a real thing, it was still capable of producing something affecting. When it chose to let Peter have a moment of genuine paternal feeling, clumsy, inarticulate, typically expressed in ways that nearly derail the situation, the character's original humanity reasserted itself. Those moments became rarer as the seasons progressed, but they never disappeared entirely. And their persistence, the fact that even in the worst seasons of the show, there were occasional episodes or scenes that recalled the character's original dimensionality, suggests that the degradation of Peter Griffin was not inevitable. It was a choice. Made episode by episode, season by season, by a writer's room that was operating under pressures that made depth harder to maintain than volume. The tragedy of Peter Griffin is not that he became a bad character. It is that he had been a genuinely interesting one, and the show let that go. Section 6. Brian Griffin, the character that broke its own promise. If Peter Griffin's story is the story of a character who was degraded over time, then Brian Griffin's story is something different, and in certain ways more poignant. Brian's story is the story of a character who was undermined by the very qualities that were supposed to define him. Qualities that the show initially presented as virtues, but gradually turned into sources of mockery, and then into sources of audience contempt, and then, in a bizarre final act, into the subject of a narrative stunt that generated more viewer grief than any plot development in the show's history. Brian Griffin, as introduced in the early seasons of Family Guy, was a joke with a philosophical foundation. The joke was simple and immediately legible. He was a dog who behaved like a sophisticated human adult. He drank martinis. He quoted literature. He was working on a novel. He had strong opinions about film and theater and politics. He was, in the social world of the Griffin household, the resident intellectual, or at least the resident aspirant to intellectualism, which is not quite the same thing. But the philosophical foundation underneath the joke was more interesting than the joke itself. Brian was an aspirant rather than an achiever. He wanted to be a serious writer, but had never finished his novel. He wanted to be taken seriously as an intellectual, but frequently exposed, through his behavior, the gap between his self-image and his actual life. He was in love with Lois Griffin, his best friend's wife, in a hopeless and largely unspoken way that gave him a particular kind of romantic melancholy. He was an alcoholic, which the show acknowledged with surprising directness in the early seasons. His drinking was not simply a character detail, but something that was occasionally addressed as a genuine problem with real consequences. What made Brian work in the early seasons was the show's willingness to be honest about the gap between aspiration and reality. Brian was not the intellectual he thought he was, and the show knew this, and played it not as contempt for Brian, but as compassion. There is something very human in the figure of the person who has a rich inner life and high standards for themselves, and yet consistently fails to produce work that matches those standards. The novel that is never finished, the screenplay that is always in development, the dreams that remain perpetually unactualized. Brian Griffin, in his best early episodes, was a figure of genuine pathos, a character whose pain was real even when his pretensions were comic. Road to Rhode Island demonstrated this beautifully, as we've already discussed. But there were other early moments that showed the same quality. In Brian, Portrait of a Dog, from the first season, Brian enters a dog show as a way to earn money, and the episode becomes an exploration of the specific indignities involved in presenting oneself for judgment. The way that performance for others requires a suppression of self that can feel like annihilation. The episode takes this theme seriously enough to land it as both funny and genuinely moving. As the revival seasons progressed, something started to shift in the show's relationship with Brian. The gap between his aspirations and his reality, which had been a source of affectionate comedy, began to be played with increasing hostility. The writers began to write Brian's intellectual pretensions as simply deserving of mockery, not as the understandable defense mechanism of a sensitive creature who has a lot to offer and has not found a context in which to offer it, but as a form of fraud, as pretension pure and simple. This shift was most visible in the show's treatment of Brian's writing. In the early seasons, Brian's unfinished novel was a symbol of his struggle with himself, of his fear of failure, of his perfectionism, of the specific paralysis that afflicts people who care deeply about their work. In the later seasons, Brian's writing became simply bad, and the show's treatment of its badness became increasingly contemptuous. Episodes in the 7th, 8th, and 9th seasons regularly featured Brian producing terrible creative work and being humiliated for it. The humiliation was not in the service of a larger point about the experience of creative failure. It was simply there, a reliable mechanism for generating a certain kind of laughter at Brian's expense. Quagmire's speech to Brian in the Season 9 episode, Jerome is the New Black, is perhaps the most explicit articulation of this shift. In it, Quagmire tells Brian, in a monologue that is clearly intended to be at least partially endorsed by the show, that Brian is a terrible person, selfish, pretentious, cowardly, a bad friend, a worse person. The speech is specific and detailed, and it is delivered with the kind of rhetorical force that indicates the writers thought they were saying something true and important. Some viewers appreciated the speech as a corrective to Brian's increasing sanctimony. Others felt, with some justification, that the show was using Quagmire to articulate a contempt for its own character that the earlier seasons had never permitted. The Brian and Stewie relationship, which had been the show's warmest and most consistently successful pairing, also underwent a transformation. In the early seasons, their relationship was defined by genuine mutual affection underneath a surface of mutual exasperation. Stewie needed Brian to actually care for him, as any baby needs a caregiver, and Brian needed Stewie to remind him that he was capable of loving something purely. In the later seasons, the show began to write their relationship with more hostility. Stewie's mistreatment of Brian became more systematic. Brian's resentment of Stewie became more explicit. And the warmth that had made their early dynamic so resonant was progressively displaced. The road to episodes remained a refuge. Even in the later seasons, when much of the show's writing had degraded, the road to episodes, Road to the North Pole, Road to the Multiverse, Road to Vegas, and others, retained something of the original spirit. They gave Brian and Stewie space to be genuinely themselves, to have the kind of extended comedic conversations that required character consistency and wit, rather than simply volume. These episodes are remarkable partly because of how clearly they demonstrate that the show was still capable, in the right context, of the quality it had abandoned in its regular episodes. And then, in Season 12, the show killed Brian Griffin. The episode was Life of Brian, which aired in November 2013. Brian is hit by a car in the episode's final act. He dies at the veterinary hospital. The family grieves. The show then, in what became one of the most emotionally manipulative sequences in the show's history, introduced a replacement dog, a character named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico, best known as Polly Walnuts from The Sopranos, and spent 2 episodes with the Griffin family adjusting to life without Brian. The viewer response was extraordinary and went well beyond normal viewer reaction to plot developments in animated shows. Petitions to bring Brian back accumulated hundreds of thousands of signatures. Angry messages flooded social media. Some fans announced they were done with the show. Others wrote long, detailed analyses of why Brian's death felt like a betrayal, not just of the character, but of everything the show had claimed to value about character depth and emotional continuity. And then just 3 episodes after Brian's death, the show brought him back. Stewie, using his time machine, traveled back to prevent the car accident. Brian survived. Vinny was erased from the timeline. The show returned to normal. The response to the revival was, if anything, even more complicated than the response to the death. Relief, certainly. But also a specific kind of anger. The anger of people who had been manipulated, who had been led to invest genuine emotional energy in a storyline that turned out to be a temporary shock tactic rather than a real creative decision. Brian's death, which had felt like a statement, turned out to be a stunt. And the difference between those two things is significant. Seth McFarland later confirmed in various interviews that the death had indeed been intended as a limited stunt, a way of generating shock and conversation during a sweeps period, with the return always planned. This admission, while honest, deepened rather than resolved the controversy. If the death was always temporary, if it was always a stunt, then what did it say about the show's relationship to its own characters? What did it say about the show's respect for the emotional investment its viewers had made? Brian Griffin, in the post-death seasons, continued to exist on the show but continued to be written with the diminished quality that had characterized his pre-death appearances. He remained, structurally, in the writer's room vocabulary, available as a character, capable of generating comedy, occasionally granted an episode that recalled his earlier dimensionality. But the promise of the character, the promise of a genuinely complex inner life explored with genuine craft, had been broken so many times by this point that it was hard to grieve specifically for it. The tragedy of Brian Griffin is the tragedy of untapped potential. He was, at his best, one of the more interesting characters in animated television. A figure whose comedy was inseparable from his genuine pain, whose absurdity was rooted in recognizable human psychology, whose relationship with Stewie was one of the most unexpectedly moving things the show had ever created. The show knew all of this. It demonstrated that knowledge in scattered, brilliant episodes throughout its run, and it consistently failed to honor that knowledge in the vast majority of what it produced. Brian deserved better. The show knew that, and it made the choice over and over, across years and seasons and hundreds of episodes, to give him worse. Section 7. Stewie, Meg, and the cruelty that stopped being funny. There is something almost poetic about what happened to Stewie Griffin over the course of Family Guy's run. He began as perhaps the most conceptually original character in the show, genuinely unusual in the landscape of animated television, a creation with no real precedent. And he ended up, in the later seasons, as a character who had been largely stripped of his original purpose and was being used primarily as a vehicle for gay jokes. That this happened gradually, and that it happened in a show that was otherwise willing to take risks, makes it a particularly interesting case study in the way that characters can be reshaped by a cultural context that changes around them, while they remain technically unchanged on screen. The original Stewie Griffin was a villain. Not a cuddly, winking, wink-at-the-camera villain. A genuine one, with genuine motivations and genuine menace. He wanted to kill Lois Griffin. He wanted to achieve world domination. He built weapons of mass destruction in his room. He spoke with a clipped, theatrical precision that suggested he had absorbed the complete works of a Victorian-era military strategist and found in them a model for both self-presentation and strategic planning. He was, as a character, operating on a completely different register from everyone else in the show, a register that the show maintained carefully in the early seasons, always keeping one foot in genuine threat, even when the comedy required the threat to be temporarily diffused. The joke in those early seasons was not simply that a baby was evil. The joke was that a baby was evil in a specific, recognizable way, in the way that a certain kind of highly intelligent person becomes evil, not through passion but through principle, not through hatred, but through a kind of cold and methodical contempt for people who don't measure up. Stewie's evil was the evil of the disappointed perfectionist. He wanted the world to be a certain way, and the world consistently failed to be that way. And his response was to construct elaborate mechanisms for destroying the things that disappointed him, beginning with his mother, who represented to him the most intimate and unescapable of his constraints. This is a rich characterization. It is the kind of characterization that takes time to develop and courage to commit to, because a genuinely evil baby is a harder sell than a lovably roguish one. The show committed to it in the early seasons, and the results were, at their best, genuinely startling. There are scenes in the first 3 seasons where Stewie's menace is played completely straight, where there is no comedic softening, where the character's threat is presented as real. And these scenes work precisely because the show trusted the premise enough not to undercut it. The gradual softening of Stewie began in the 4th season of the revival. The world domination plots became less frequent. The attempts on Lois's life became rarer, and then essentially disappeared. The character's attention shifted from strategic evil to a more general lifestyle commentary. He became a vehicle for jokes about cultural sophistication, for observations about the gap between his intelligence and the people around him, for increasingly frequent suggestions about the character's sexuality. The sexuality element is worth addressing directly because it is both the most discussed aspect of Stewie's later characterization and, in many ways, the most illustrative of the show's larger creative problems. The jokes about Stewie's possible homosexuality began as occasional, subtle suggestions, an unusual interest in certain male celebrities, a reaction to a situation that could be read in multiple ways. This ambiguity was defensible creatively and had a certain wit to it. The ambiguity was part of the joke. Stewie, who presented himself as a figure of absolute self-knowledge and self-mastery, might be harboring a secret about himself that the audience could see and he could not. But over time, the ambiguity collapsed into something less interesting. The jokes became explicit rather than implied. Stewie's sexuality became not a dimension of a complex character, but the primary fact about him, the thing around which his scenes were organized. The reliable generator of the specific kind of comedy the show was now consistently relying on. The character, who had been a study in a particular kind of intellectual grandiosity, became a series of repeated references to a single trait. This is a problem that goes beyond whether the jokes are offensive, though some of them are, in ways that deserve to be acknowledged. The deeper problem is that the reduction of Stewie's characterization to a single dominant trait is the same process that was simultaneously reducing Peter, Brian, Quagmire, and everyone else in the show. It is the process of Flanderization as a systemic failure rather than an individual one. The show was doing it to everyone, and the results were visible in everyone. And then there is Meg. Meg Griffin deserves her own careful attention, because what happened to Meg Griffin over the course of Family Guy is one of the most sustained and deliberate character decisions the show ever made, and one of the most morally complicated. Meg began as a teenage girl in the tradition of the invisible, slightly awkward girl who exists in every social ecosystem. Not popular, not particularly gifted in ways that generate status, genuinely trying, consistently humiliated. This is a recognizable archetype, and in the early seasons, the show used it with something that functioned as affection. Meg's humiliations were the humiliations of adolescence, recognizable and therefore, in the specific way of comedy, slightly consoling. If Meg's experiences were funny to you, it was partly because they recalled something familiar. Over the seasons, the humiliations escalated. Meg was hit. Meg was verbally abused. Meg was explicitly told by her family that they didn't care about her. Meg's attempts to connect with her family were rebuffed, not with the exasperated affection of early season Family Guy, but with something colder and more dismissive. The show developed a running gag in which Meg's very presence was treated as an inconvenience or an offense. Peter would dismiss her in mid-sentence, the camera would cut away from her mid-thought. The show would physically remove her from scenes in which her presence was inconvenient. By the middle seasons of the show, Meg's treatment at the hands of her family had become something that required justification, rather than simply something that generated comedy. The show attempted that justification most explicitly in Seahorse Seashell Party, the season 10 episode that is now widely regarded as one of the most controversial in the show's history. In that episode, Meg finally confronts her family about their treatment of her. She says things that are true and specific and emotionally grounded. She names the behaviors. She identifies the patterns. She demands to be treated with basic human dignity. And for a brief moment, the episode seems to be doing something genuinely interesting, treating Meg's perspective as valid, allowing her to have the conversation that the show had been structurally preventing for 9 seasons. And then the episode reverses itself. Meg decides, is persuaded, essentially, by the show's internal logic, that she serves a necessary function for her family as a lightning rod, absorbing their dysfunction so that they can remain functional. She retracts her confrontation. She resumes her position as the family punching bag. The episode ends with the status quo restored. The critical debate about this episode has been extensive. Some viewers and critics have argued that it is, in a perverse way, the show's most honest statement about its own structure. An acknowledgement that Meg's abuse is a narrative device, that it exists for the show's benefit, and that the show is aware of what it's doing. Others have argued, with equal force, that this self-awareness makes the episode worse rather than better, that a show that knows it is treating a character cruelly and then constructs a justification for continuing to do so is doing something more troubling than a show that simply hasn't thought about it. The second argument is the stronger one. Comedy is not absolved of ethical consideration simply because it knows what it's doing. A joke that is cruel is not made less cruel by the joke teller's acknowledgement of the cruelty. Meg's treatment in Family Guy's later seasons was genuinely cruel, not in the sense that a fictional character's well-being is equivalent to a real person's, but in the sense that the show's systematic devaluation of a female character sent consistent signals about what kind of person deserves to be treated that way, and that those signals accumulated over 15, 16, 17 seasons into something that deserved serious examination. Stewie and Meg together. One character emptied of purpose and refilled with a single reductive trait, the other used as a structural target for abuse, represent two different failure modes of the show's relationship to its characters. Stewie's failure was the failure of a character whose specificity was gradually stripped away until only a single dimension remained. Meg's failure was the failure of a character who was denied specificity from the beginning and then punished repeatedly for that lack of definition. Both failures were choices, made by a writer's room that was, in its best moments, genuinely brilliant and, in its worst moments, genuinely careless. Made by a production system under pressure to deliver content at a pace that made careful character thinking hard to sustain. Made by a show that had been given more seasons than it knew what to do with, and had found, in each additional season, slightly less reason to do its best work. The cruelty in Family Guy is a subject that the show itself, to its credit, eventually began to acknowledge. Not through reform, the later seasons show no sustained effort to treat Meg with more dignity or to restore Stewie's original menace, but through occasional gestures of self-awareness that suggest the people making the show knew, on some level, what had been lost and what had been done. That self-awareness, present but insufficient, is perhaps the most heartbreaking quality of the show's later seasons. It is the self-awareness of something that knows it could be better and has made peace with not being. Section 8. The writer's room, the strike, and the cutaway machine television comedy is made in rooms. Specifically, it is made in writer's rooms. Long tables, bad coffee, whiteboards covered in half-formed ideas, and anywhere between 6 and 20 people spending hours together, arguing about whether a particular joke is funny or whether a particular story turn makes sense for a character they have all spent years thinking about. The writer's room is the engine of a television comedy series, and the quality of what comes out of a show is almost always a direct reflection of the quality of the collaboration happening inside that room. Understanding what happened to Family Guy over its long run requires understanding what happened to its writer's room, not as gossip, as craft analysis. Because the show's decline is not simply a story about Seth McFarland walking away, or about Fox demanding more episodes than the creative team could sustain at their best level. It is also a story about a specific creative tool, the cutaway gag, and how that tool changed from a precision instrument in skilled hands into a crutch that the room leaned on harder with every passing season. Let's start with the cutaway itself. The cutaway gag is a form of non sequitur comedy that has roots stretching back before Family Guy. You can find precursors in everything from early television sketch comedy to the film work of Woody Allen to the British comedic tradition of Spike Milligan, who was doing essentially the same structural move in radio in the 1950s. The basic mechanism is simple. You are in the middle of a scene and a character makes a reference that triggers an escape from the scene. A visual illustration of something, a brief alternate reality, a complete non sequitur that has no direct narrative connection to what's happening, but that generates comedy through contrast, through absurdity, through the particular pleasure of an unexpected detour. Family Guy did not invent this form, but it developed it to a degree that it had not been developed before in American animated comedy. In the early seasons, the cutaways were doing something quite specific. They were functioning as a kind of stream of consciousness commentary on the world of the show. They followed a dream logic that, while disconnected from the literal narrative, was connected to the emotional or thematic content of the scene they interrupted. Peter mentions something embarrassing, and the cutaway illustrates an entirely different, unrelated embarrassment. Stewie references a historical atrocity, and the cutaway takes us there in a form that is both absurd and oddly historically specific. The connections were invisible but present. The best cutaways in the early seasons were also extremely tightly constructed. They had the structure of a well-told joke, setup, development, punchline, compressed into 15 or 20 seconds. They arrived, delivered their effect, and departed. They trusted the audience to get the joke without over-explaining it. And they were chosen with something that can only be described as editorial taste. A sense that this particular cutaway at this particular moment, in this particular episode, served a function beyond simple time filling. The writers who produced those early cutaways were, in many cases, the same writers who had been in the room from the beginning of the show, people who had developed, through years of collaboration, a collective sense of what the show's humor was and what it wasn't. The cutaway wasn't a template that new writers could simply slot material into. It was a technique that required genuine comic sensibility to deploy well. As the show continued and the writers' room changed, as original writers moved on and were replaced, as the room expanded to accommodate higher episode orders, as the production pace increases, the cutaway began to change too. Not in its form exactly, but in its function. The precise editorial judgment that had governed its deployment in the early seasons became less reliable. Cutaways that were adequate rather than excellent made it into final cuts because the production schedule didn't permit indefinite refinement. Cutaways that were simply provocative, that generated a reaction through shock or offense without requiring the audience to find them genuinely funny, became more common as shortcuts to a response that the writers knew would land. And then came the extended cutaway. This is the form that critics most consistently identify when discussing Family Guy's later season problems with its comedy. The extended cutaway is a cutaway that has been stretched beyond its natural comic endpoint, past the moment where the joke has made its point and the audience has received it, into a kind of comedic dead zone, where the joke's repetition is itself supposed to be generating a different kind of laughter. This technique, deployed very sparingly, can be genuinely funny. There is a specific kind of comic pleasure in a joke that refuses to end, a pleasure that comes from the discomfort of the refusal, from the growing absurdity of the insistence that this moment must continue. The best examples of this technique in comedy history work because the refusal to end is itself commenting on something, on the nature of comedy, on the audience's expectations, on the thing being depicted. Family Guy's use of extended cutaways in its later seasons was, with occasional exceptions, not this. The Conway Twitty gag, in which the show would cut from a scene to a full, uninterrupted performance of a Conway Twitty song, became emblematic of a different kind of extended cutaway use. Not the use that comments on anything, not the use that generates a specific kind of sophisticated discomfort, but the use that simply fills time. The Conway Twitty gags ran for minutes. They were not about Conway Twitty. They were not about anything. They were, in their most charitable reading, a form of anti-comedy, a joke about the absence of a joke. In their least charitable reading, they were a production team telling their audience that they had run out of things to say and didn't particularly care. In November 2007, a real-world event intervened in Family Guy's production history in ways that deserve careful attention. the Writers Guild of America, the union representing the writers of American film and television, went on strike. The strike lasted from November 5, 2007 to February 12, 2008, approximately 100 days. It was the longest WGA strike in history at that point, and it disrupted the production of virtually every scripted show on American television. The strike was about residuals, specifically about whether writers were entitled to compensation when their work was distributed through emerging digital platforms. In 2007, streaming as we now understand it barely existed, but the industry could see where things were heading, and writers wanted to establish compensation structures for that future before the industry locked in norms that excluded them. It was a principled stand by writers who were being asked to give up rights to work they had created, and it generated significant industry solidarity. Seth McFarland was an outspoken supporter of the strike. He was seen on picket lines. He used his public profile to advocate for writers' rights. His commitment to the labor action was genuine and consistent, but the strike also interrupted the production of Family Guy and of American Dad, at a particularly sensitive moment in both shows' development. The practical impact of the strike on Family Guy's writing process was significant. The room was disbanded. Scripts in development were halted. The institutional momentum that sustains a writer's room, the ongoing conversations, the half-formed ideas being developed across multiple sessions, the collective memory of what has and hasn't been tried, all of that stopped. When the strike ended and the room reconvened, it was reconvening after more than 3 months of separation, and the reconstituted room was not identical to the one that had been disbanded. Writers who had found other opportunities during the strike were not all available to return immediately. The rhythm that had been developed before the strike needed to be rebuilt. This disruption is not by itself enough to explain the decline in writing quality that became visible in the seasons surrounding the strike. But it is a contributing factor, one more element in the accumulation of pressures that were making it harder for the show to consistently produce its best work. The seasons immediately surrounding the strike, seasons 6, 7, and 8, show the show at a particularly inconsistent level, with occasional brilliant episodes coexisting with episodes that feel almost careless. The most insightful criticism of Family Guy's cutaway dependency came, famously, not from a television critic, but from another television show. South Park's 2-part episode Cartoon Wars, which aired in 2006, includes a now legendary sequence in which the show depicts Family Guy's comedy as being generated by a group of manatees who randomly push idea balls together. The implication is clear. Family Guy's comedy is not crafted, but generated, not the product of intelligent creative decisions, but of random recombination. The manatees push the balls, and whatever combination results becomes a cutaway gag. It would be easy to dismiss this as competitive snark from a rival show, and there is certainly an element of that. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have never disguised their low opinion of Family Guy's writing, and they are not exactly disinterested observers. But the critique lands because it identifies something real. The best cutaway gags in Family Guy's early run were not the product of random recombination. They were specifically crafted for specific moments, and the specificity was part of what made them work. By the middle and later seasons, an increasing proportion of the cutaways were, if not random in a literal sense, approaching random in their relationship to the episodes they were embedded in. They could have been placed in any episode and functioned equally well. Their connection to the characters, to the story, to the emotional register of the scene they interrupted had become attenuated to the point of invisibility. The production pace also deserves specific attention as a factor in the decline of writing quality. In the seasons following the revival, Family Guy was producing between 20 and 22 episodes per year, which is at the upper end of what network animated series typically produce. Each episode, as previously noted, has a production pipeline of 9 to 12 months. This means that at any given moment, the writers are working on episodes that won't be seen for the better part of a year, while simultaneously finishing the writing stages of episodes that are months away from completion. In practice, this means that a writer's room working at this pace rarely has the time to do what the best writer's rooms do: argue a script to death, throw out a version that isn't working, rewrite from scratch based on an insight that arrived late. Instead, you write a version, you revise it, you adjust the pacing, you hope the animation and voice performances will smooth over whatever hasn't quite clicked in the writing stage, and you move on because you have 17 other scripts at various stages of development that also need your attention. This is the context in which the show's writing quality degraded. Not through laziness, the people in the room were working hard, but through the specific kind of quality erosion that happens when the volume demands of production exceed the time available for genuine creative development. The cutaway, in this context, was not just a comedic device. It was a production tool. It filled time. It generated moments that could be isolated from the episode and shared online, creating the impression of a show generating content even when the episodic stories were thin. It was efficient in the ways that a mass production environment needs things to be efficient. The tragedy is that the early show had demonstrated, beyond any doubt, that Family Guy was capable of being something other than efficient. It was capable of being genuinely excellent. And the excellence had been generated not despite the constraints of the medium, but in creative conversation with them. Finding the spaces within those constraints where something surprising could happen. That creative conversation had not entirely ended by the later seasons, but it had become intermittent, occasional, a bright thread running through a fabric that was otherwise significantly coarser than it had once been. When it appeared, in the best road to episodes, in Brian and Stewie, in scattered moments throughout the later seasons, it reminded you of what the show had been, and therefore of how far it had traveled from that origin. The distance between origin and destination is, in the end, the central fact of Family Guy's history. The show that began as a pitch by a passionate 24-year-old creator with specific and original things to say became, over 2.5 decades, a production machine that continued to generate episodes because the economics made sense. The transition between those two states was not sudden. It was the accumulated product of 1,000 small decisions, each defensible in isolation, that together produced a result no individual decision could have caused. Section 9. Seth MacFarlane. Steps back and what the show lost. There are photographs from the late 1990s, production stills, behind-the-scenes snapshots, the kind of images that end up in retrospective documentaries that show Seth MacFarlane in the early years of Family Guy's production. He is in his mid-20s. He is animated in the literal and figurative senses of the word, gesturing, laughing, leaning forward toward whoever he's talking to, with the focused energy of someone who is doing exactly what they want to be doing. He is in recording booths doing 4 different voices in an afternoon. He is in writers' rooms with a whiteboard behind him, covered in episode outlines. He is at his desk with scripts that are visibly covered in handwritten notes, revisions, arrows connecting ideas from one margin to another. He was everywhere. That was the thing about the early years of Family Guy. Seth MacFarlane was everywhere in the creative process. Not just as the creator and primary voice actor, but as the active, engaged, opinionated driving force of a show that was, in the most literal sense, his vision made real. He cared about the jokes. He cared about the character consistency. He cared about the animation choices. He cared about whether the timing in a particular scene was landing correctly. This is not a universal quality among television creators. The industry is full of people who created shows that became successful and then, quite reasonably, delegated the day-to-day creative work to trusted deputies while they pursued other projects. This is how the economics of successful television production work. You do not scale to 17 seasons of a show by having one person personally supervise every creative decision. The institutional structure of a successful show requires a showrunner infrastructure. Experienced writers who know the characters deeply, production executives who can hold the machine together, a creative culture that can sustain itself even when the original creator is working on other things. The difference, in Family Guy's case, was that the show's creative identity was so specifically and personally MacFarlane's that the delegation created a vacuum. The sensibility that had generated the show's best work, the particular combination of warm humanism and sharp irreverence, the willingness to go dark that was always balanced against genuine emotional investment in the characters, the instinct for timing that comes from spending your entire life thinking about comedy. That sensibility was Seth MacFarlane's. It existed in the room when he was there. It was harder to sustain when he wasn't. Around 2010 and 2011, McFarland's active involvement in Family Guy's daily creative process decreased significantly. He remained the show's executive producer and continued to voice Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, roles that required his presence in the recording booth and that kept him connected to the characters in the most direct way possible. But the writing, the story development, the day-to-day creative decisions, the oversight of scripts through the many revisions that the production pipeline requires, these responsibilities were increasingly handled by others. The showrunners who took on the creative leadership of Family Guy in McFarland's reduced role were Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin. Both were experienced television writers with deep knowledge of the Family Guy universe. Appel had been with the show since the early revival seasons, and Sulkin had joined during the same period. They were professionals. They understood the show. They were, by the accounts of people who worked with them, capable and conscientious showrunners. But, and this is the essential point, they were not Seth MacFarlane. They had not created these characters. They had not built this world from scratch with the specific set of experiences and instincts and memories that shaped MacFarlane's relationship to it. They could maintain the show. They could run the production. They could keep the machine generating episodes at the pace that Fox required. What they could not do was replicate the specific creative intelligence that had made the show special in its early years, because that intelligence was not a set of rules that could be documented and followed. It was a sensibility. It lived in a person. And when that person was no longer in the room every day, it became unavailable. MacFarlane's shift away from Family Guy was driven by multiple factors, not all of them about creative priorities. The most significant was his expanding ambitions in other creative directions. His feature film career, which had been a long-held aspiration, began to materialize in a serious way with the development of Ted, a comedy about a man who has been inseparable from his magically animated childhood teddy bear since childhood. MacFarlane wrote, directed, and starred in the film. It was released in June 2012 and became an enormous commercial success. It earned over $549 million worldwide against a budget of $50 million, making it, at the time, the highest-grossing original R-rated comedy in film history. Ted demonstrated something important, that Seth MacFarlane's comedic sensibility was not specific to animated television. The humor of the film, its mixture of affectionate nostalgia, crude shock comedy, and underlying genuine warmth, was recognizably from the same creative mind that had made Family Guy work in its early years. The film was not perfect, and it had its critics, but it was also clearly the work of someone who was operating with intentionality and craft. MacFarlane followed Ted with A Million Ways to Die in the West in 2014, a Western parody that he also wrote, directed, and starred in. That film performed less well critically and commercially. It earned approximately $89 million worldwide against a production budget estimated at $40 million, which, when distribution and marketing costs are included, represented a modest financial disappointment. The critical reception was mixed at best. Then came Ted 2 in 2015, and then, most significantly from the perspective of MacFarlane's creative investment, The Orville in 2017. The Orville is a science fiction series that MacFarlane has described as a love letter to the original Star Trek, and it represents something genuinely different from everything else he had made. It is not primarily a comedy. It is a drama with comedic elements, a show that takes seriously the tradition of science fiction as a vehicle for exploring philosophical and ethical questions. MacFarlane wrote extensively for it, was its showrunner, and starred in it. He clearly cared about it in a way that went beyond commercial interest. The Orville is, in the judgment and mind of many critics who have followed MacFarlane's career, the most creatively ambitious thing he has ever made. It is also the thing that most clearly demonstrates what he is like as a creator when he is fully engaged. The show has genuine ideas. It has characters who develop over time in ways that honor their established personalities while allowing them to genuinely change. It has emotional stakes that are earned rather than manufactured. It is, in essentially every creative metric that matters, the opposite of the Family Guy that was being produced simultaneously. This parallel existence, MacFarlane making his most creatively invested work on The Orville, while Family Guy continued to produce episodes with decreasing creative ambition, is one of the most illuminating ironies in his career. It proves that he had not lost his capacity for quality. It proves that the sensibility that made early Family Guy great had not been extinguished by time or success. It had simply been redirected elsewhere. The relationship between McFarland and Fox, the network that had canceled Family Guy twice before becoming its long-term broadcast home, had been complicated for years. McFarlane is, by temperament and conviction, politically liberal, significantly so, and with the kind of public willingness to express political views that makes some people in the entertainment industry uncomfortable. Fox, as a broadcast network, shares a corporate parent company with Fox News, and the political valences of those two entities are substantially different. McFarland's discomfort with this association became increasingly public as the years went on. In 2019, he posted on social media that Tucker Carlson's commentary on Fox News made him wish Family Guy was on any other network. In subsequent interviews, he used the analogy of a failing marriage to describe his relationship with Fox. Two parties who had been together long enough that separation was complicated, but who both knew, on some level, that the relationship was no longer working in the way it once had. In January 2020, McFarland signed a 5-year overall deal with NBC Universal, reportedly worth approximately $200 million. This deal meant that his production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, would develop new projects for NBC Universal's various properties, the NBC Network, Universal Pictures, and the streaming platforms associated with those companies. It was a significant shift. McFarland was building his future with a different corporate entity, one that had no connection to Fox News and none of the complicated associations that came with the Fox relationship. Family Guy was, in this new arrangement, effectively the anchor that kept McFarland tied to Fox. He was contractually obligated to continue voicing the characters. The show continued to air on Fox, but everything new he was developing, everything he was excited about, was going elsewhere. This situation created a specific creative dynamic that deserves acknowledgement. McFarland was, in the later seasons of Family Guy, a man voicing characters whose stories he was not fully shaping, on a show he had mixed feelings about, for a network he had publicly expressed frustration with. He continued to show up. He continued to perform his vocal performances with professionalism. By all accounts, he remained engaged with the characters in the specific way that voice work requires. But the full creative engagement that had characterized his relationship to the show in its early years, the everywhere quality of his involvement, was no longer present. During the 2023 Writers Guild of America strike, the second major writers' strike that Family Guy's production had navigated, following the 2007 to 2008 strike, McFarland again visibly supported the striking writers. He was photographed on picket lines. He made public statements about the importance of writers' rights in the streaming era. His support for labor was genuine and consistent. But the strike also represented another disruption to the creative machinery of a show that had already been struggling. Another period of uncertainty. Another reassembly of a creative team that had been scattered by circumstance. Another set of episodes that would be made under the shadow of interrupted momentum. In April 2024, McFarland gave a widely reported interview in which he discussed the future of Family Guy with a candor that was, depending on how you read it, either refreshingly honest or slightly uncomfortable. He said that the show had reached what he called escape velocity, that it had been running for so long that there was no rational reason to stop it unless the audience stopped watching, and that as long as people found value in it, he saw no reason to end it. He framed this in partly philanthropic terms. The show generated revenue that he directed toward environmental causes, specifically through organizations working on rainforest preservation. He was clear that the show continued to have value on those terms. What was absent from that interview, and what struck several commentators at the time, was any expression of creative excitement about the show. There was no "I have a story I want to tell" energy. There was no "the characters have somewhere interesting to go." There was frank acknowledgement that the show was a machine that kept running because the economics supported it, and that this was, on balance, fine. This is a very different energy from the person who, at 24, had pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox with an enthusiasm that the network found contagious enough to greenlight a series. The distance between that person and the person giving that 2024 interview is, in some ways, the most complete measure of what had happened to Family Guy across its decades on air. The show had not lost its creator. He was still there, in the recording booth, still doing the voices. But it had lost the creative heart of its creator, the part that genuinely needed to make it, that had something specific to say through it, that believed in its characters as real enough to be worth protecting. That heart had gone elsewhere, and in its absence, the show had become what a lot of successful, long-running entertainment properties become when the person who first gave them life moves on. A legacy brand, an economic asset, a machine that knows how to generate its product efficiently, and that has largely stopped asking whether that product is as good as it could be. Section 10. The numbers don't lie. Ratings, revenue, and the long decline. There is a kind of honesty in numbers that opinion can never quite match. You can argue indefinitely about whether a show is funny or whether its characters have been well served by their writers, whether a particular creative decision was justified, or whether a shift in tone was handled gracefully. These are genuinely debatable questions, and the people on different sides of them are often all right in partial ways, seeing the show through the lens of their own relationship with it, their own point of entry, their own particular investment in specific characters or episodes or moments. But ratings are not opinions. They are counts. They tell you, in terms that admit no subjective interpretation, how many people chose to be somewhere at a particular time. And the ratings history of Family Guy is one of the most complete records available of what happens when a beloved show slowly loses the qualities that made people love it. Let's start at the very beginning, because the beginning is as high as the numbers get. January 31st, 1999. The Super Bowl has just ended. A new animated comedy is about to premiere. 22 million people are watching. This is not a show that built an audience gradually, that found its footing over a few seasons before the numbers reflected its quality. Family Guy debuted with the largest audience it would ever have, because it debuted in the most watched moment in American television, the immediate aftermath of the Super Bowl. The network had bet big. The bet was visible in the placement. Following that premiere, the show's numbers settled into the 8 to 12 million range during its first 3 original seasons. These are not numbers that, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, would have guaranteed a show's survival on a major network. The competitive landscape of American broadcast television in that era was significantly different from what it would become even a decade later. Streaming did not exist. Cord cutting had not begun. The fragmentation of the audience that would eventually make 8 million viewers a remarkable achievement was still in its early stages. In 1999, 8 million viewers was a decent number, but for a primetime Fox show with animation production costs, it was not enough. The show needed to grow, and it wasn't growing fast enough. Fox moved it around the schedule, tried it in different time slots against different competition, and eventually canceled it in 2002 when the ratings dipped below what the network considered acceptable. The revival, as documented in earlier sections, changed everything temporally. The 4th season return in 2005 drew 11,850,000 viewers for its premiere, more than the show had ever drawn in its original run. The Adult Swim audience, the DVD buyers, the fans who had spent 3 years evangelizing for the show and converting others into believers, had created a level of demand that Fox's scheduling had previously been unable to capture. Through the 5th and 6th seasons, the numbers remained strong by the standards of animated primetime television. The show was regularly competing with, and often beating, its companions in the Sunday night animation lineup. By any reasonable commercial measure, the Family Guy revival was a success. And then, slowly, the erosion began. By season 8, the ratings had begun to decline from their revival-era heights. Viewership in the 7 to 8 million range gradually became viewership in the 5 to 6 million range. The decline was gradual enough that it was explainable in any given season by factors unrelated to the show's quality. The fragmentation of the television audience, increased competition from cable, the growth of DVR and time-shifted viewing that made live ratings a less accurate measure of total viewership than they had once been. These explanations were not wrong. They were accurate descriptions of real trends that were affecting every broadcast network show simultaneously. But they were also, in Family Guy's case, too convenient. Because while all broadcast network shows were experiencing some degree of ratings decline due to audience fragmentation, Family Guy's decline was steeper than most of its peers. The Simpsons, a show that had been on the air for over 15 years by this point and was dealing with its own quality criticisms, was declining more slowly. American Dad, which aired in the same block and had a fraction of Family Guy's cultural cachet, was declining even more slowly. The specific steepness of Family Guy's decline suggested that factors beyond general audience fragmentation were at work. By season 13, which aired in 2014 and 2015, average viewership had fallen to 5,860,000. That is a loss of nearly 6 million viewers from the revival era highs in under a decade. By any standard, this is dramatic. The decline continued. Season 16, airing in 2017 and 2018, averaged 3,300,000 viewers. Season 18, airing in 2019 and 2020, fell below 2 million for the first time. Season 20 averaged 1,310,000 viewers with a 0.45 rating in the 18 to 49-year-old demographic that broadcast networks use as their primary measure of commercial value. And then Season 23, which aired beginning in February 2025, averaged approximately 723,000 viewers with a 0.19 demographic rating. Take a moment with that number, 723,000. A show that debuted to 22 million viewers was, in its 23rd season, watched by fewer people than live in many American cities. The show that had once been the centerpiece of Fox's Sunday night animation block, the anchor around which the network's most prestigious animated properties were organized, was now drawing an audience that would have been considered catastrophic for any primetime broadcast network show in any era. The shift in the show's network treatment reflected these numbers honestly. For most of its run, Family Guy had occupied the 9 p.m. Sunday slot in Fox's animation domination block. Sunday night on a major network is valuable real estate. It's when audiences are home, when they're settling in for the week ahead, when they're most likely to watch television in the traditional appointment television manner. The 9 p.m. slot was where Fox kept the properties it considered most commercially valuable. In 2019, Family Guy was moved from 9 p.m. to 9:30 p.m., a slight demotion, but one that the industry read as a signal. The 9:30 slot has historically been the place that networks put shows they're less certain about, shows that need the lead-in from the 9 o'clock anchor to build their audience, rather than being an anchor themselves. For the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season, the more dramatic shift came. Family Guy was removed from the Sunday night animation domination block entirely. Its slot was given to other programming. When Family Guy returned to the schedule, it was placed on Wednesday nights, weekday primetime, rather than the weekend evening position it had occupied for most of its existence. The show hadn't aired on a weekday since the troubled early years of its original run, when Fox's scheduling experiments had contributed to the ratings problems that led to the first cancellation. In the television industry, being moved from a prestigious weekend night to a weekday is a clear signal. It means the network no longer considers you a headliner. It means you've been reclassified from a show that audiences seek out to a show that fills a slot. It means the executive calculation has shifted from "this show deserves the best placement" to "this show can adequately occupy a lower priority position." The irony of these scheduling decisions is that they echo almost exactly the scheduling decisions that led to Family Guy's original cancellations in 2000 and 2002. Then, Fox's movement of the show around the schedule was a cause of ratings problems. The audience couldn't find it. Now, the movement reflected ratings problems that were already present. The audience had found it, and largely decided not to watch. Despite these numbers, the show has been renewed repeatedly and continues to be renewed. This apparently paradoxical situation makes sense once you understand the economics of animated television and the specific revenue ecosystem that Family Guy has built over 25 years. Animated shows are, as a production category, significantly cheaper to make than live-action drama or even live-action comedy. There are no sets to build or maintain. There are no location shoots. The visual component is handled by animation studios. In Family Guy's case, studios in Korea and elsewhere that work at costs substantially lower than American production labor. The voice cast records their lines in a studio, which is efficient. The writing room is the primary, above-the-line creative expense. The overall per-episode cost of Family Guy is a fraction of what a comparable live-action show would cost. This cost structure means that a show can remain economically viable at audience sizes that would be terminal for more expensive productions. 700,000 live viewers combined with the revenue from syndication, streaming licensing, and merchandising represents a positive return on investment for an animated show that is relatively inexpensive to produce. Family Guy airs in syndication on Adult Swim. It streams on Hulu, which has a massive subscriber base and licenses the show as part of its content library. It airs on FXX. It generates merchandise revenue from a brand that is globally recognized, regardless of current viewership numbers. The cumulative value of these revenue streams, across a show with over 400 episodes in its library, is substantial. In April 2025, Fox and Disney, Family Guy's corporate parent company having acquired 21st Century Fox's entertainment assets, announced that the show had been renewed through its 27th season, which would take it to the 2028 to 2029 television season and coincide with the show's 30th anniversary. Each season under the new deal would consist of 15 episodes. The show was not just surviving, it was being guaranteed years of additional existence by a corporate decision that weighed revenue against cost and found the calculation favorable. Seth MacFarlane commented publicly on this renewal with a pragmatism that was entirely consistent with his 2024 interview. He did not describe excitement about the creative opportunities the renewal represented. He described the show's continuation in terms of its continued relevance to audiences and its philanthropic utility. The framing was honest. It was also, to anyone who remembered the energy of the show's early years, slightly melancholy. There is a way of reading the ratings history of Family Guy that is simply a story of decline. Numbers going down over time, audience drifting away, a show losing relevance. But there is a more useful way to read those same numbers, as a record of the conversation between a show and its audience. The audience was not passive. They were not simply leaving because other things competed for their attention, though other things did. They were responding to what the show was giving them. The decline in viewers from the mid-revival peak to the current era corresponds, with reasonable precision, to the periods when the show's quality was most visibly compromised. The audiences for seasons 5 and 6 were larger than the audiences for seasons 12 and 13. The audiences for seasons 12 and 13 were larger than the audiences for seasons 20 and 21. The audience was shrinking in correlation with the show's creative deterioration. They did not make arguments about flanderization or cutaway overuse in the language that critics use. They just stopped watching. Their absence from the viewership counts is the most direct possible form of criticism. A wordless, aggregated judgment made by millions of people who had once found something worth their time and gradually found it less so. The numbers don't lie, but they also don't explain. For the explanation, for the story that tells us why those numbers went the way they went, we have to keep looking at the creative history, which is where we've been all along in this slow and detailed journey through the show's long and fascinating, and finally, quite dark history. Section 11, American Dad, The Orville, and The Roads Not Taken. Every story about a thing that went wrong contains, implicitly, a story about how it might have gone right. The Road Not Taken is always present as a kind of ghost, visible in the same way that the original pencil lines are visible under a finished painting, if you look at it in the right light, from the right angle. For Family Guy, The Road Not Taken is not hypothetical. It exists. It has been airing on television for roughly the same period of time as Family Guy itself, and it has been quietly, persistently doing the things that Family Guy stopped doing. That road is called American Dad. American Dad premiered on February 6, 2005, just a few months before the Family Guy revival. It was created by Seth MacFarlane together with Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman. The show followed Stan Smith, a CIA agent who was patriotic to the point of self-parody, physically imposing, emotionally limited, and incapable of irony. And his family. His wife Francine, their college-age daughter Haley, their high school-age son Steve, their alien house guest Roger, and their CIA-modified pet goldfish Klaus, who had the brain of a German Olympic skier implanted in his fish body. On paper, American Dad sounded like a Family Guy derivative. Same creator, same network, same Sunday night time slot. It aired immediately after Family Guy for most of its Fox run. It had the same basic structure. A family organized around a patriarch, supplemented by fantastical supporting elements that allowed the show to range freely through genre and premise. It had the same willingness to address social and political issues through comedic satire. Critics and audiences initially received it as a lesser version of the original, a backup show that was benefiting from Family Guy's revival momentum without earning its own right to exist. They were wrong, they were substantially, demonstrably wrong. And the way in which they were wrong tells you a great deal about what Family Guy had been doing right in its earliest days and what it had stopped doing. The foundational difference between American Dad and Family Guy is the absence, in American Dad, of the cutaway gag. This single structural decision ramified through every other aspect of the show's production. Without the cutaway as a fallback, the writers of American Dad were forced to build every episode as an actual story. A narrative with a beginning, a development, a complication, and a resolution that emerged from the characters rather than from random tangents. Every joke had to come from the situation. Every funny moment had to be earned by the dramatic setup. There was no mechanism for papering over a thin story with a collection of disconnected but individually amusing gags. This constraint is exactly the kind of constraint that makes writers better. The best creative work is almost always done under meaningful constraints, because constraints force the development of resources that unlimited freedom would never have required. American Dad's writers, unable to fall back on cutaways, developed an extraordinary facility for character-based comedy. Comedy that emerged from the specific personalities of specific people in specific situations. Comedy that worked because you understood the characters well enough to find their behavior both surprising and inevitable. Stan Smith's development as a character illustrates this perfectly. He began as a broad political caricature, a George W. Bush-era right-wing archetype, jingoistic, paranoid, incapable of nuance. In the hands of writers less committed to genuine character development, he could have remained this, and the show could have spent 15 seasons mining the same satirical territory. But the American Dad writers chose a different path. They allowed Stan to be wrong, regularly and specifically. They allowed the consequences of his being wrong to accumulate. They allowed his relationships with his family, relationships that were initially as damaged by his limitations as Peter Griffin's relationships were, to actually change over time, to develop real history, to sustain genuine emotional stakes. By the middle seasons, Stan Smith had become one of the most complex characters in animated television. He was still politically absurd, still capable of spectacular misjudgment, still the engine of the show's satirical humor. But he was also unmistakably a person, a man with a complicated relationship to his own vulnerability, a man who had been raised in environments that taught him to be certain and who found genuine uncertainty both terrifying and secretly liberating, a man whose love for his family was real and growing, even as his capacity to express that love remained limited by everything he was and everything that had made him. This is character development. This is the thing that Family Guy stopped doing with Peter Griffin somewhere around season 7 or 8, and that American Dad never stopped doing with Stan Smith. Roger the Alien is the other great creative achievement of American Dad, and he deserves detailed attention, because he represents one of the most elegant solutions to the character development problem that long-running animated series face. The problem is this: animated characters don't age. They don't change their circumstances in the ways that human characters change theirs. They don't get older, they don't move away, their relationships don't transform through the accumulation of lived experience. The show has to find ways to keep characters interesting across hundreds of episodes without the built-in narrative engine of time. Roger's solution to this problem is his personas. Roger, as an alien with no fixed identity of his own, adopts human personas as a coping mechanism. Elaborate, fully realized characters with names, backstories, mannerisms, fashion choices, and moral codes that are often entirely inconsistent with each other. He has been, across the show's run, a drug lord's accountant, a flamboyant fashion designer, a small-town gossip columnist, an elderly cat lady, a professional athlete, a Mexican wrestler, a jazz musician, an insurance adjuster, and hundreds of other characters. Each persona is fully committed to. Each persona generates different comedy. Each persona allows the show to explore a different social or professional world. This is an inexhaustible well. The persona concept doesn't get stale because it's designed to constantly renew itself. Every new persona is a new opportunity for a new kind of comedy, a new milieu, a new set of social observations. Compare this to Stewie Griffin's situation, a character with a brilliant original concept who was abandoned by his writers when they ran out of specific evil plans, rather than finding the broader structural innovation that would have allowed the concept to keep generating material indefinitely. Stewie could have been given the equivalent line of personas. He was, after all, a baby with a fully adult intelligence operating in the world. The opportunities for him to inhabit different roles, different covers, different disguises were always present. The road to episodes, the best of which function essentially as genre parodies, where Stewie gets to be different kinds of hero or villain, pointed toward this possibility. But the show never developed it into a consistent structural innovation. It remained occasional and unsystematic. American Dad, by contrast, built Roger's personas into the fundamental architecture of the show, and then mined that architecture for years. Francine Smith's arc across American Dad's run is another instructive comparison. Francine is, in her basic setup, similar to Lois Griffin, the patient wife who holds the family together, who is more capable and more clear-eyed than her husband, who has her own history and her own desires that the show sometimes explores. But Francine remained a character whose complexity was consistently honored. Her backstory: she was adopted, she has complicated feelings about her biological family, her relationship with her own identity is layered in ways that the show continues to develop, gave the writers material that sustained genuine storytelling interest across hundreds of episodes. Her relationship with Stan deepened and changed, rather than degrading into a series of repetitive conflict and reset cycles. American Dad moved from Fox to TBS after its 11th season in 2014. This was a potentially traumatic transition for a show, losing the platform and promotional infrastructure of a major broadcast network, moving to a cable channel with a different audience demographic and a different corporate culture. Plenty of shows have not survived similar transitions, either losing their creative identity in the adjustment, or simply losing the audience that had been built on the original platform. American Dad survived and, by most accounts, flourished. The move to TBS gave the writers more freedom. Cable television allows content that broadcast standards don't, and the show took advantage of that latitude. The episodes made for TBS are, on balance, more consistently ambitious and more consistent in quality than the later Fox seasons. The creative team had developed enough institutional confidence in the show's identity that a change in distribution platform could be absorbed without destabilizing the core of what the show was. This transition stands in direct contrast to Family Guy's insistence on remaining at Fox despite the complicated dynamics of that relationship. McFarland's public frustrations with the network, his eventual deal with NBC Universal for his future projects, his comments about wishing Family Guy was on a different network, all of these suggest that the Fox relationship had become constraining rather than enabling. American Dad's transition to TBS suggests that there was a viable path for animated comedy outside the Fox broadcast ecosystem. Family Guy never took it. Seth MacFarlane's The Orville represents yet another road not taken, or rather a road taken for a different journey. The Orville is, as discussed in the previous section, the most fully realized expression of MacFarlane's creative ambitions in his post-Family Guy dominant phase. It is a science fiction drama with genuine intellectual ambitions, episodes that are willing to sit with ethical dilemmas without resolving them neatly, characters who grow and change in ways that require an audience to maintain continuity of attention across a season or multiple seasons, production values that communicate genuine investment in the visual world of the show. There is a poignant quality to watching The Orville alongside late-season Family Guy. One is a show made by a man who has found, in a different form, the creative engagement that his earliest work expressed. The other is a show made in the day-to-day creative sense by people doing the best they can with a franchise whose original creator has moved on. The difference in energy is palpable. The Orville feels made by someone who needed to make it. Family Guy, in its later seasons, often feels made by people who were good at their jobs, but who were not, in the deepest sense, driven by creative necessity. This is not a criticism of the people who made the later seasons of Family Guy. They were professionals. Some of them were genuinely talented. The show continued to produce, scattered through the later seasons, episodes that demonstrated genuine craft and genuine creative ambition. The problem was not the absence of individual talent. The problem was the absence of a unified creative vision a sense of what the show was for, what it was trying to say, why it needed to exist rather than simply continuing to exist. That unified vision had been Seth MacFarlane's in the early years. It had lived in his specific relationship to these characters, his specific understanding of what they were and what they were capable of. When he stepped back, the vision didn't transfer. Visions don't transfer, they live in people. What was left was the infrastructure of the show, the characters as they had accumulated, the vocabulary of the humor, the franchise identity. All of these could be operated. None of them could be originated. American Dad's success is the clearest possible evidence that the decline of Family Guy was not inevitable. The same creative mind, applied with more consistent engagement to a show with slightly different structural properties, produced something that aged better. The same Sunday night slot, the same corporate parent, the same era of television production, and a substantially different result. Because the result was determined not by external circumstances, but by choices. By the choice to develop characters rather than reduce them. By the choice to tell stories rather than generate moments. By the choice to maintain creative investment rather than treating a show as a franchise to be managed. Those choices were made across hundreds of episodes over more than 20 years. And the cumulative product of those choices is the history we have been tracing together in this slow, quiet, late-night journey through the dark side of one of television's most fascinating careers. Section 12. Legacy, Controversy, and What Family Guy Actually Meant. We have traveled a long way together tonight, through the quiet New England hills where Seth MacFarlane grew up drawing comics at 8 years old. Through the Providence Design School where he made the shorts that would become a show. Through the Fox boardroom where a 24-year-old creator got the green light. Through the cancellations and the reruns and the miracle revival. Through the slow degradation of characters who deserved better and the gradual erosion of a creative vision that had once been genuinely original. Through the ratings decline and the corporate renewals and the increasingly complicated relationship between a show and its creator. Now let's take the wider view. Let's try to understand what Family Guy actually was, what it achieved, what it failed to achieve, and why the story of its decline feels like more than just a story about one television show. Family Guy's legacy is genuinely paradoxical. On one hand, it is one of the most successful animated comedy franchises in television history. Over 400 episodes, renewed through its 27th season. A cultural imprint that extends far beyond its current viewership. Characters that are recognizable globally, catchphrases that entered the lexicon, a visual vocabulary that influenced virtually every animated comedy that followed it. The show is everywhere in the way that very few television programs ever become everywhere. Its clips circulate endlessly online. Its characters appear on merchandise sold on every continent. It is, by the blunt measure of market penetration, an unqualified success. On the other hand, it is a show that used to be better, and not just a little better. The gap between the best Family Guy and the average late-season Family Guy is not the modest gap that separates a good show from a very good show. It is the significant gap between work produced at the highest level of a medium and work produced to adequate commercial standards. The show's own history stands as its most damning critic, because the show's own history contains proof of what it was capable of being. This is what makes the Family Guy story worth telling in detail, worth examining slowly and carefully. It is not simply a story about decline, it is a story about the relationship between creative ambition and commercial success, between artistic vision and franchise management, between the thing a creator makes and the thing that thing becomes when it outlasts the creator's full engagement with it. The controversy that surrounded Family Guy across its run. The Parents Television Council complaints, the international bans, the angry fan petitions, the academic discussions of its treatment of Meg and women more generally, is part of this legacy, and it deserves honest treatment rather than either dismissal or amplification. Some of the controversy was the predictable result of a show that was genuinely pushing against the limits of broadcast television content. A show that wanted to be more explicit, more politically direct, more willing to address subjects that primetime television had traditionally handled with euphemism or avoidance. This kind of controversy is part of the price of ambition. Shows that try to say things that haven't been said before will sometimes say things that cause reactions. The reaction is evidence of the attempt, not necessarily evidence that the attempt was wrong. But some of the controversy, particularly the controversy surrounding the show's treatment of Meg, the escalating graphic violence, the shift from dark humor to shock value, pointed to something different. It pointed to a show that had stopped being provocative in service of ideas and had become provocative in service of reaction. The distinction is important. Provocation in service of ideas generates conversation, challenges assumptions, occasionally changes minds. Provocation in service of reaction generates clicks, headlines, and temporary attention without any lasting cognitive or emotional residue. Family Guy was, at various points in its history, doing both kinds of provocation. The difficulty is that the ratio between them shifted over time, and not in a favorable direction. The early seasons had substantially more of the first kind. The later seasons had substantially more of the second. This is not a unique trajectory in the history of entertainment. It is, in fact, a well-documented pattern in long-running commercial comedy properties that were originally motivated by genuine creative ambition. The ambition gradually gives way to formula. The formula gradually prioritizes what is reliably successful over what is genuinely interesting. The result is a product that continues to function, but has lost something that cannot be recovered through skill or effort alone. Because what it has lost is not a technique, but a relationship. A specific creative relationship to the material that existed in a specific time and context and cannot be reconstructed. The show's place in the history of animated television is nonetheless secure and significant. Family Guy, along with South Park and the later seasons of The Simpsons, established that animated comedy could occupy the same cultural space as the most ambitious live-action television, could address political subjects with genuine complexity, could build characters with real psychological interiority, could sustain emotional storylines across multiple episodes, could reach audiences that had been told, implicitly, that animation was for children. This is not a small achievement. It is not something that can be retracted by the quality of the show's 22nd season. The show also had a genuine and substantial impact on the comedic culture of the 21st century. The cutaway gag, for all its later problems, was a structural innovation that influenced the vocabulary of American comedy across multiple media. The road to episodes established a template for animated adventure that other shows borrowed and developed. The willingness to do full musical numbers, elaborate production quality song and dance sequences embedded in regular episodes, gave subsequent shows permission to be more musically ambitious than the genre had traditionally been. These contributions persist independent of the show's creative decline. The show's relationship to its fan base is also part of its legacy and a genuinely interesting part. Family Guy's fans were lined out, particularly the fans from the revival era who had discovered the show through Adult Swim reruns and DVD purchases and who had, in some meaningful sense, demonstrated through their consumer behavior that they valued it enough to spend money on it when it was no longer on the air, had an investment in the show that went beyond normal viewer affection. They had saved it. They felt, with some justification, that they had a particular relationship to the thing they had saved. When the show began to degrade, the disappointment of these fans was especially acute, because the thing they had invested in had been transformed into something other than what they had valued. This is the most personal dimension of the Family Guy story. It is not a story about a corporation's product failing to maintain its quality standards, or about a creative industry's inability to sustain excellence indefinitely. It is a story about people who loved something, and who watched the thing they loved change in ways that felt like loss, and who continued to care about what it had been even as they had complicated feelings about what it had become. The show that aired after the Super Bowl in 1999, the show about a large, dim, fundamentally loving father and his strange, brilliant, exhausted family in a small Rhode Island neighborhood, was made by someone who was pouring something genuine into it. The jokes were specific because they came from a specific creative sensibility. The characters were coherent because someone had thought carefully about who they were and what they wanted. The warmth was real because it was the warmth of a creator who cared about the people he had made. That show still exists. It is available on streaming platforms. You can go back to it. You can watch the early seasons and find, in them, something that the later seasons cannot quite replicate. Not because the craft is superior in every technical dimension, but because the creative relationship between the maker and the material is visible in every frame. You can feel someone caring, you can feel someone trying, you can feel the specific energy of a young person with something to say who has been given, against all reasonable expectation, the platform to say it. That show deserves to be remembered as what it was, one of the genuinely original contributions to American comedy. A show that built something new out of elements that already existed. A show that gave its characters real interiority, even when the comedy was broad. A show that knew how to be dark without being merely cruel, how to be transgressive without being merely offensive, how to build a joke that was funnier the more carefully you thought about it. The later show, the one that generated the declining ratings and the controversy about Meg and the endless Conway Twitty segments, that show also deserves honest engagement. It deserves engagement not as a curiosity or as evidence for a thesis about creative decline, but as what it actually was. A show being made by talented people under significant commercial and structural pressures, trying to produce quality work in a context that made quality work difficult to sustain, occasionally succeeding and more often falling short. The people who made those later seasons were not malicious. They were not lazy in any simple sense. They were people doing a job under conditions that had drifted far from the conditions that had produced the job's best work. The Family Guy story is ultimately a story about creative vitality and its limits. It is a story about the difference between making something because you need to make it and making something because the machine needs to be fed. It is a story about how the commercial success of a creative work can, paradoxically, become the thing that prevents the work from achieving the quality that generated the success. It is a story that recurs across the entire history of popular culture, in music and film and television and literature. The story of the thing that was brilliant, and then, by incremental degrees, became merely proficient, and then merely adequate, and then merely present. What makes Family Guy's version of this story worth the attention we've given it tonight is that it happened so publicly, over so long a period, with such complete documentation available. Every season is preserved. Every episode is watchable. The arc is visible to anyone who cares to trace it. You can watch the warmth drain away. You can watch the characters simplify and then distort. You can watch the cutaways multiply and the stories thin. You can see in the progression from Season 1 to Season 23 a complete record of the choices that shaped the thing and the consequences those choices generated. And you can also see in that same record the moments when the show remembered what it had been. The moments when someone in the room, whether that was McFarland in the recording booth hearing a line that didn't ring true, or a writer fighting for a character moment that the schedule pressures were pushing out, or an episode that somehow found its way back to the original creative register, remembered what the show was capable of. Those moments are still in there. They are still visible. They prove conclusively that the capacity was never gone. The show that made Brian and Stewie in Season 8 was capable of the same quality as the show that made Road to Rhode Island in Season 3. The same characters, the same creative DNA, the same potential. The potential was always there. The question was always whether the people responsible for it would choose to honor it on any given day, in any given episode, across any given season. Sometimes they did. More often, in the later years, they didn't. And the distance between those two states, between the show at its best and the show as it most commonly operated, is the dark side of Family Guy. It is a darkness that comes not from malice, but from the slow accumulation of compromises, from the replacement of creative necessity with commercial adequacy, from the gradual departure of a specific human voice from the thing that voice created, from the discovery, made season by season, that a show could continue to exist without the qualities that made it worth existing. Family Guy was great. It became, over time, something less than that. Both of those facts are true, and neither one cancels the other out. The greatness is real and lasting. The decline is real and documented. The show is all of it. The early brilliance and the later exhaustion. The characters at their fullest and the characters at their most reduced. The jokes that landed because someone had thought about them for a long time, and the jokes that didn't because someone hadn't thought about them at all. That is what a television show is over 25 years. It is everything. It is the sum of everyone who ever worked on it, every decision that was made and everyone that wasn't, every episode that landed and everyone that didn't, every viewer who stayed and everyone who eventually turned it off. It is a human document of its own specific kind, sprawling, inconsistent, occasionally brilliant, frequently frustrating, alive in its best moments with the specific energy of someone who cared deeply about whether it was good. And now, in this quiet hour, let's let it rest. Let the early episodes play out in your mind if they want to. Peter doing something catastrophically stupid, and Lois sighing, and Brian saying something dry, and Stewie plotting something elaborate, and the world of the show being, for that half hour, exactly what it should be. Let the warmth of it settle. There are worse things to fall asleep to than the memory of something that used to be genuinely good. There are worse things than spending a quiet night with the story of how something original came into being and what happened to it over the long years it lived in the world. The story has been told. The dark side has been examined. And somewhere underneath all of it, the original show is still there, still broadcasting, in the only way that art broadcasts once it has been made, into the memory of everyone who ever watched it and found something in it that they recognized as true. Extended section. The episodes that define the dark side. A detailed walkthrough. Let's slow down even further now. The hour is later, the world outside is quieter. This is the part of the night where we can afford to be unhurried, to let the details accumulate, to spend time with specific moments in specific episodes and understand what they tell us about the show's trajectory. There are certain episodes in Family Guy's run that function as landmarks, not because they are the best or the worst the show produced, but because they represent, in concentrated form, a particular phase of the show's creative evolution. Understanding these episodes in detail is understanding the show's history from the inside rather than from the outside. Death Has a Shadow, the pilot episode from January 31st, 1999, is where everything begins. Watch it now more than 25 years after it aired, and what strikes you is its relative modesty. The jokes are mostly small. The cutaways are brief and somewhat tentative. They haven't yet found the aggressive confidence they would develop in subsequent seasons. The characters are recognizable but still slightly unformed, like a sketch that hasn't been fully inked in. Peter is warm but broad. Lois is patient but thin. Stewie delivers his lines with the menace the character will become famous for, but hasn't yet developed the full theatrical register that will make him memorable. What the pilot has, despite all its roughness, is a clear sense of what the show wants to be. It wants to be funny. It wants to have heart. It wants to feel like a world that could be inhabited rather than a joke delivery machine. These ambitions are visible in the construction of even simple scenes. The way Peter's relationship with his friends at the bar is played with enough warmth that you believe in the friendship. The way Lois's relationship with Peter is drawn with enough affection that her exasperation with him feels like love rather than contempt. The pilot is not the show at its best, but it is the show with its intentions most clearly visible. Road to Rhode Island, from the third season's original unaired episodes, is a different kind of landmark. It is the episode that proved the show could do something beyond the episodic format it had been using, that it could sustain a longer narrative with real character development, that Brian and Stewie as a pairing had chemistry beyond anything the main family storylines were generating. The musical number in this episode, Brian's song about his mother, performed with a rawness that is startling in context, is one of the 2 or 3 moments in the entire show's run where something genuinely moving is happening rather than being simulated. Why does it work? Because it is earned. The scene arrives at a point in the episode where Brian has been established through the previous 40 minutes as a character with real loss in his history, real regret, real longing. The song is not simply inserted. It is the moment where the emotional logic of the episode arrives at its destination. The comedy that surrounds it provides the contrast that makes the emotion land. And the brevity of the moment, the show doesn't dwell in it, doesn't explain it, lets it happen and then moves on, gives it dignity that a longer, more self-conscious treatment would have destroyed. Petarded, from the 4th season's revival, is the episode that showed the first clear signs of what Peter's character was becoming. The premise: Peter discovers he has a measurable intellectual disability, is played partly with sensitivity and partly with the kind of extended gag reliance that would become more prevalent in subsequent seasons. The episode is not uniformly good, but it is interesting precisely because of how clearly you can see the tension between the old approach and the new one. Some scenes treat Peter's situation with genuine compassion. Others use his condition as the setup for jokes that feel more mean-spirited than the earlier seasons would have permitted. The episode is a document of a show in transition, not sure yet whether it's going to continue honoring its characters or begin exploiting them. Stewie Loves Lois, from the 5th season, gave us one of the most unexpectedly tender treatments of the Stewie-Lois relationship in the show's run. The premise, Stewie, after a traumatic medical experience, becomes overwhelmingly attached to his mother, is played with a sincerity that the character's early villain persona would never have permitted. This episode is evidence of what the Stewie redesign could have been, if it had been executed with this level of care more consistently. It shows a character who has genuine emotional complexity, who can be funny and also be moved, who has a real relationship with his mother that is not defined entirely by either the murder plots of the early seasons or the dismissive indifference of the later ones. Jerome is the New Black, from Season 8, is the episode that contains Quagmire's famous speech to Brian. This speech, direct, specific, brutal, functions in the show's history as both a creative achievement and a missed opportunity. As a creative achievement, it is one of the most precisely written pieces of character-based comedy the show produced in its later years. Every accusation Quagmire levels at Brian is backed by the show's own depiction of Brian's behavior. The speech works because it is specific, because it names things, because it has the quality of long-accumulated frustration, finding its precise articulation. As a missed opportunity, the show used this speech to acknowledge what Brian had become, and then continued to write Brian as that same person in subsequent episodes. The acknowledgement without change is, in its way, more frustrating than simple unawareness would have been. The show knew what it had done to Brian. It said so, in Quagmire's words, with unusual directness. And then it did it again, and again, and again. The speech was not a turning point. It was a formal acknowledgement of a status quo that the show had no intention of changing. Brian and Stewie, from Season 8, is the episode that most completely demonstrates what the show was still capable of in its middle period. 2 characters in a bank vault, no plot. No cutaways. Just conversation that becomes, over the episode's runtime, increasingly honest. Brian's revelation about his suicidal thoughts. Stewie's demonstration that his love for Brian is real and specific. The episode does what the early show did at its best. It takes a comedy premise, 2 mismatched characters stuck in a room, and mines it until it has produced something that functions as genuine feeling. Seahorse Seashell Party, from Season 10, is the episode that crystallizes everything that had gone wrong with Meg's storyline, and by extension, with the show's relationship to moral consequences. As described in detail in an earlier section, this is the episode where Meg confronts her family and then retracts the confrontation, accepting her role as the family's designated target. The episode is technically competent. It is not poorly made. It is written with some care. But the specific thing it chooses to say, that a victim of sustained abuse should accept her abuse to preserve the stability of the people abusing her, is indefensible in a way that the show either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. The episode's placement on fan lists of worst episodes is not due to poor production, but to the specific moral failure of its conclusion. Life of Brian, from Season 12, is the most commercially calculated episode in the show's history. The death of Brian Griffin was not a creative decision in the way that character deaths in shows with genuine narrative courage are creative decisions. It was a ratings event. It was designed to generate shock, grief, and conversation. To trend on social media, to be covered by mainstream news outlets, to pull lapsed viewers back to the show for the spectacle of an irreversible event. And it worked in those narrow terms. The episode generated exactly the coverage and the viewer response the network was looking for. But the subsequent reversal, Brian's return just 3 episodes later, retroactively converted the death from a creative event into a marketing exercise. The show, in undoing the death, told its audience something about itself that audiences generally find difficult to forgive. It told them that their emotional investment in the characters did not matter, that it could be solicited and then discarded when it served a tactical purpose. This is the kind of betrayal that erodes the fundamental trust between a show and its viewers, a trust that, once eroded, is very difficult to rebuild. Back to the Pilot, from season 10, contains one of the show's more interesting self-critical moments. Brian and Stewie travel back to the events of the first episode, and the show uses this opportunity for a form of meta-commentary on its own history. There is a moment in this episode where characters from the original pilot can be seen standing in awkward silence during a cutaway, waiting for the gag to end. It is the show explicitly acknowledging, through comedy, the critique that cutaways disrupt narrative continuity and leave characters stranded without purpose. It is a funny moment. It is also, as noted earlier, a form of self-awareness that the show treated as a joke rather than as a note to act on. It saw the problem, illustrated it for comedic effect, and then returned to the behavior that generated the problem. These episodes, taken together, tell the story of a show that had genuine creative intelligence throughout its run, that was capable of producing, at various points across many seasons, work that demonstrated real craft and real thought. The story they tell is not a story of a show that ran out of talent. It is a story of a show that repeatedly chose, when talent and convenience were in conflict, to choose convenience. The talent was always there. The choice of whether to honor it was made episode by episode, season by season, and the aggregate of those choices is the creative history of Family Guy. Extended section: the world that surrounded the family, how the supporting cast was lost. Long-running ensemble comedy shows live and die not just on the strength of their central characters, but on the richness of the world around them. The supporting cast, the neighbors, the recurring characters, the peripheral figures who populate the world and give it the texture of a real place where real things happen, is what makes a fictional setting feel inhabited rather than constructed. When the supporting cast is done well, it contributes its own independent comedic logic to the show, creates relationship dynamics that the central characters can't generate on their own, and provides the writers with a flexibility that allows the show to range freely through different emotional and comedic registers. Family Guy's supporting cast in the early seasons was genuinely strong. The three-man supporting group centered around Peter's bar companions, Cleveland Brown, Glenn Quagmire, and Joe Swanson, gave the show an outer ring of characterization that enriched the central Griffin family stories considerably. Cleveland Brown was introduced as the most measured and emotionally intelligent of Peter's friends, a man who responded to Peter's chaos with patience rather than complicity, who had his own interior life and his own quiet warmth. His relationship with his wife Loretta was depicted with enough specificity to function as a genuine subplot across the early seasons, rather than simply as background material. When that marriage fell apart, in the 7th season episode where Loretta's affair with Quagmire is discovered, the show treated it as a real event with real consequences, not simply as a setup for jokes. Cleveland's grief was palpable. His friendship with Peter became, in those episodes, a vehicle for examining how men support each other during emotional crises they lacked the vocabulary for. Cleveland eventually became the central character of a spin-off series, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013. The show performed inconsistently and was canceled after 4 seasons. What is interesting about The Cleveland Show in retrospect is that it demonstrates both the depth of Cleveland's original characterization — he was a compelling enough character to anchor his own series — and the limitations of what the show did with that characterization once it had him as a lead. The transition from supporting player to protagonist brought Cleveland into focus in ways that revealed both his strengths and the ways in which his characterization had been simplified from its original richness. When Cleveland returned to Family Guy following the cancellation of his spin-off, the show never quite reintegrated him with the specificity that had made him interesting in the early seasons. He returned as a supporting player, but as a slightly flatter one than he had been at his best, a character who had been through his own spin-off and returned slightly changed, slightly less grounded in the specific details that had made him feel real. Quagmire's trajectory is its own complicated story. Glenn Quagmire, the hypersexual, relentlessly pursuing neighbor, whose catchphrase "giggity" entered the American vernacular, was played in the early seasons with a self-awareness about his own behavior that made his dysfunction into something more than simple predatory behavior. He knew what he was. He didn't apologize for it, but he also didn't seem unaware of it. There was a specific kind of rueful self-knowledge in early Quagmire's characterization that gave the jokes about his behavior something to bounce off. As the seasons progressed, that self-knowledge diminished. Quagmire became more broadly drawn, his sexual predation more extreme, less self-aware, more simply presented as fact rather than as a character trait embedded in a psychology. The episodes that explored his backstory, most notably Quagmire's dad from Season 8I, which revealed that Quagmire's father was a transgender woman, and which generated significant controversy for its handling of transgender identity, tried to give his characterization more depth, but were doing so at a point when the character had already been substantially simplified from his original form. Joe Swanson, the wheelchair-using police officer, followed a similar trajectory to what was described in the main text, beginning as a figure of genuine respect and quiet dignity, and becoming, over the later seasons, primarily a vehicle for disability-based comedy that the character's original characterization would not have permitted. The show was never quite able to decide what Joe's disability meant, whether it was a character trait that gave him specific depth, or whether it was simply a comedic attribute to be deployed for gags. In the early seasons, the ambiguity was productive. In the later seasons, the scale tilted consistently toward the gag. The broader world of the show, the town itself, the secondary recurring characters, the institutional presences like James Woods Regional High School, also suffered from the same simplification that affected the main cast. In the early seasons, the show had developed a genuine geography. You knew where the Drunken Clam was in relation to the Griffin house. You had a sense of the neighborhood's social dynamics. The institutional characters at Meg's school had personalities beyond their functions. Over time, the world contracted. The geography became less consistent. Secondary characters who had appeared regularly in early seasons disappeared without comment. New characters were introduced and then abandoned. The show's world became more of a backdrop than a setting, a collection of signifiers that established context without genuinely communicating place. This contraction of world is related to the contraction of character complexity that we've discussed throughout this long evening together. When a show stops being interested in its world, when it stops investing in the secondary and tertiary characters that give a world its texture, it signals a broader withdrawal of creative investment in the project of making the fictional universe feel real. A show where only the main characters matter is a thinner show than a show where everyone in it seems to have a life going on beyond the edge of the frame. Family Guy's early seasons had that quality of extension. You could believe that Cleveland and Quagmire and Joe and the rest had lives that continued beyond the scenes where they appeared. The later seasons gave you less reason to believe this. The world had shrunk to what was needed and no more. This is not merely an aesthetic observation. It has practical comedic implications. Comedy is funnier in a world that feels real, because a world that feels real provides unexpected friction and unexpected opportunities. The early season jokes about the town's eccentricities, about the specific social dynamics of a specific kind of New England working-class community, were funnier because they were grounded in something. The later season jokes about the same settings were thinner because the settings had lost their specificity. You were laughing at a sign pointing at a place rather than at the place itself. The show's relationship to actual Rhode Island, to the state's specific culture, geography, and social character, deserves a note here. Family Guy has always been set in a fictional Rhode Island town, and in the early seasons, the show made occasional use of genuine Rhode Island specifics. The proximity of Providence, the particular quality of New England's small city life, the cultural textures of a post-industrial region that was finding new ways to identify itself. This specificity was never dominant. Family Guy was always primarily a show about an American family, rather than about Rhode Island specifically, but it was present, and it contributed to the sense that the show was set somewhere real, rather than in a generic American suburban nowhere. As the seasons continued, this geographical specificity largely evaporated. The town became increasingly generic, indistinguishable in most of its institutional and cultural details from any other medium-sized American city in any part of the country. The jokes stopped drawing on Rhode Island particulars and started drawing on universal American suburban experience. This is not a catastrophic failure. The show was never primarily a regional comedy, but it is one more dimension in which the show's world gradually became less specific and therefore less interesting. Extended section: The cultural footprint. How Family Guy shaped comedy. After it even at its most diminished, Family Guy's cultural footprint is impossible to ignore. The show exists in the culture in the way that very few television programs ever managed to exist. Not just as a show that people watched, but as a set of references, rhythms, and comedic approaches that influenced an entire generation of comedy writers, content creators, and viewers. Understanding that footprint, understanding what the show exported to the broader culture, is part of understanding its legacy. The most direct and visible cultural export was the cutaway gag structure itself. Before Family Guy popularized it, cutaway-style comedy, the sudden departure from narrative into self-contained comic detours, existed in various forms, but was not the dominant organizing principle of any major American comedy show. After Family Guy made it central to its identity, the structure proliferated. It appeared in other animated shows. It appeared in live-action sitcoms in slightly modified form. It appeared in the structure of online video comedy, where the principle of rapid departure from narrative into self-contained comic moments became arguably the dominant organizing principle of YouTube humor, of Vine, of short-form internet comedy in general. The irony of this cultural export is that the cutaway worked best in the context where it was developed, as a supplement to, rather than a replacement for, strong character-based storytelling. When other shows borrowed the structure and used it as their primary comedic mechanism from the start, without the foundation of genuine character work that Family Guy's early seasons had built, the results were often worse than the Family Guy episodes that inspired them. The structure without the substance produced shows that felt more hollow than their inspiration even at its later, weaker stages. Family Guy also contributed significantly to the normalization of what might be called long-form absurdism in American television comedy, the willingness to commit to an absurd premise for an extended period rather than quickly retreating to realism. The show's extended gags, its willingness to spend a full minute on something that most comedy programs would have ended in 10 seconds, its commitment to following a joke past the point of comfort and out the other side. These were techniques that influenced subsequent comedy shows, whether or not those shows acknowledged the influence. Bob's Burgers, which premiered on Fox in 2011, and which became the spiritual successor to what Family Guy had been at its best, a show about a working-class family with genuine warmth, consistent characterization, and jokes rooted in character psychology rather than random absurdism, was made by a generation of writers who had grown up watching both the best and the worst of Family Guy and had drawn specific lessons from both. The lessons from the best: character consistency generates better comedy than character simplification. The lessons from the worst: the cutaway is a tool to be used sparingly, not a primary narrative mechanism. The internet's relationship with Family Guy is perhaps the clearest measure of the show's cultural footprint. In the mid-2000s, as YouTube emerged and internet video culture began to form its habits and preferences, Family Guy clips became one of the dominant types of shared video content. The self-contained quality of cutaway gags, their ability to function independently from the episode context that surrounded them, made them ideal for the clip-sharing format that internet comedy culture was developing. You could share a 30-second Family Guy cutaway with a friend who had never watched the show, and it would be funny on its own terms because it didn't require the narrative context. This virality was a commercial asset for the show and a cultural amplifier for its specific comedic vocabulary. But it also, paradoxically, contributed to the creative problems discussed throughout this video. When a show discovers that its most shareable moments are the ones least connected to its narrative, the cutaways, the isolated gags, the moments that can be understood without any context, there is a natural commercial pressure to produce more of those moments and less of the contextual material that surrounds them. The show's internet virality rewarded exactly the tendency toward cutaway dependency that critics identified as the primary driver of its creative decline. Family Guy's influence on internet comedy, more broadly, on the style of humor that dominated platforms like Reddit, 4chan, and eventually Twitter/X, Instagram, and TikTok, is real and documented, though it exists alongside influences from South Park, Futurama, and other animated comedies of the same era. The specific register of ironic, self-aware, reference-heavy, occasionally deliberately offensive humor that characterized much of early internet comedy culture has clear antecedents in Family Guy's approach, particularly in its post-revival seasons when the show was at the height of its online virality. This is a complicated inheritance. The humor that Family Guy popularized and that internet culture amplified is humor that can be genuinely liberating. Humor that refuses to be respectful of things that don't deserve respect, that finds comedy in the gap between official culture and actual human experience, that is willing to go to uncomfortable places in pursuit of a genuine laugh. At its best, this is valuable. It is the humor that keeps official culture honest, that deflates pomposity, that makes it possible to talk about difficult things without being crushed by their weight. At its worst, it is the humor of people who have learned that transgression generates reactions and have stopped caring whether the transgression serves any purpose beyond the reaction itself. This is the humor that Family Guy was producing in its worst later season episodes. The humor that made critics and fans uncomfortable not because it was saying something challenging, but because it had stopped saying anything at all and was simply producing discomfort as a substitute for content. The show's impact on animation specifically, on the generation of animated comedy that followed it, is significant. Shows that premiered in the late 2000s and 2010s and that operated in roughly the same tonal space as Family Guy's revival era. American Dad, Bob's Burgers, Archer, Rick and Morty, The Last Man on Earth, were all made by people who had watched Family Guy and drawn conclusions, positive and negative, about what animated comedy could and should do. The positive conclusions: animated comedy can have real emotional depth, can sustain genuine character development, can address serious subjects through comedic framing without trivializing them. The negative conclusions: cutaway dependency produces shows without stories, character simplification produces shows without stakes, shock value produces shows without lasting impact. Rick and Morty, in particular, represents an interesting case study in what animated comedy could do when it took Family Guy's irreverent ambition and applied it more rigorously to character and narrative construction. Rick and Morty has its own significant problems as a show, its own debates about consistency of quality, its own complicated relationship with its fan base, its own creator controversies. But it has consistently done what Family Guy at its best did, and what Family Guy in its average later season episodes failed to do. It has treated its main characters with genuine complexity, refused to simplify them for comedic convenience, and honored the emotional and narrative consequences of its own storytelling. The cultural conversation about Family Guy, about what it was, what it became, what it meant, is itself part of the show's cultural footprint. The show generated, across its run, a body of critical discussion that extended from television journalism into academic media studies into fan analysis on online forums. People wrote long, careful essays about the treatment of Meg. They produced detailed, season-by-season quality analyses. They developed vocabulary, flanderization, shock value comedy, cutaway dependency, for discussing the specific failures they were observing. This body of discussion, generated by people who cared enough about the show to analyze its failures in detail, is itself a kind of tribute to the show's original achievement. You only write 3,000 words about why a show's character development has failed if the character originally represented something worth caring about. Family Guy generated that writing because it had been worth caring about. The critical analysis of its decline is the flip side of the affection people had developed for it at its best. The two things are inseparable. The disappointment requires the original investment. The investment was real. The show had earned it in those early seasons with genuine creative achievement. And the story of what happened after, the long, detailed, fascinating, somewhat melancholy story we've been exploring across these many sections, is the story of what it looks like when a genuine creative achievement becomes a commercial franchise, and when the people responsible for it make different choices than the ones that produced the achievement. Those choices are documented. They are visible in every season. They are what this long, slow, late-night journey has been about. Final section: a gentle goodbye, and why any of this still matters. The room is very quiet now. Whatever time it is where you are, whether it's the deep hollow of 2 or 3 in the morning, the soft gray before dawn, or simply the particular silence of a late evening when the day's noise has finally settled, You've stayed with this story for a long time. Thank you for that. There's something genuinely meaningful about spending a quiet night with the history of something, turning it over in the light, looking at all the sides of it. Let's do one final thing before we let this go. Let's ask the question that the whole journey has been building toward. The question underneath every other question in this story. Why does it matter? Why does the rise and fall of an animated comedy show, however beloved, deserve this much attention, this much careful thought? It matters, I think, for a reason that goes beyond Family Guy specifically. It matters because Family Guy's story is a story about the relationship between creative people and the institutions that host their work. Seth MacFarlane was a specific person with a specific vision, and Fox was a specific network with specific commercial requirements, and the long history of their association was a history of the negotiation between those two things. The early seasons represent a period when that negotiation was working, when the commercial requirements were flexible enough to permit genuine creative ambition, and when the creative ambition was generating content that justified the commercial investment. The later seasons represent a period when the negotiation had shifted, when the commercial requirements had become more dominant, when the creative ambition had been redirected elsewhere, when the show was being produced according to a logic that prioritized continuity over quality. This negotiation between the person who makes something and the institution that houses it is one of the fundamental tensions of creative work in any commercial medium. It doesn't resolve cleanly. The institutions are not villains. Without networks and studios and platforms, the shows don't get made. The creators are not always right. Commercial pressures sometimes push creative people toward clarity and focus that pure artistic freedom would not have generated. The relationship is genuinely complicated, genuinely necessary, and genuinely generative of both the best and the worst that commercial creative industries produce. Family Guy's story is a clear, well-documented instance of this negotiation playing out over a very long time. It is visible in a way that more obscure stories are not, and it generates specific lessons about what that negotiation looks like when it's working and when it isn't. When it's working, the creator is deeply involved. The characters are being developed rather than reduced. The show's identity is specific and consistent. The writing room has the time and the institutional support to do its best work. The commercial requirements are present but not dominant. When it isn't, the creator has moved on emotionally and practically. The characters are being operated rather than inhabited. The show's identity has diluted into a brand. The writing room is producing efficiently rather than excellently. The commercial requirements have become the primary logic. Family Guy went through both of these states, visibly, documentably, over more than 25 years. And the show in both states is available to watch, which means the difference is demonstrable rather than theoretical. There is one more thing worth saying before we drift off entirely. It is something about the persistence of the original. Whatever happened to Family Guy in its later seasons, whatever choices were made, whatever characters were simplified or treated poorly, whatever jokes were too long or too cruel or too lazy, none of it erases what came before. The early seasons are still there. The pilot is still there. Road to Rhode Island is still there. The best episodes are still as good as they ever were. The characters at their best, Peter when he was lovable rather than cruel, Brian when he was a failed writer who genuinely tried, Stewie when he was genuinely dangerous, Meg when she was allowed to be a human being rather than a target. Those characters still exist in those episodes. Art doesn't get retroactively worse because of what was made after it. Road to Rhode Island is not diminished by the existence of a terrible season 15 episode. The warmth of the early Griffin family is not canceled out by the coldness of the later one. The good is real and remains real, and it is worth cherishing independently of what came later. This is what it means to love something that has a history. You don't have to love all of it equally. You don't have to pretend the decline didn't happen. You don't have to forgive the choices that produced the decline. But you can hold both things at once. The genuine greatness of the beginning and the genuine disappointment of what followed. And find in that tension something that is more honest than either pure celebration or pure criticism. Family Guy was worth loving. It gave something real to the people who loved it at its best. And the story of what happened to it The long, complicated, occasionally dark story we've been telling tonight is worth knowing because knowing it means understanding something genuine about how creative work lives and changes in the world, about what institutions do to visions, about what time does to everything. It means understanding that the kid from Connecticut who drew comics at 8 years old and made a show at 24 and poured himself into it for years, that person and that creative energy were real. The show they made was real. The decline was real too. And all of it together is the story. Not just the good parts, all of it. In this quiet final moment, if there are things from this video that stuck with you, ideas you want to push back on or develop further, memories of specific episodes that mean something to you, drop them in the comments. There's a community that watches these late-night deep dives together from all sorts of strange and quiet corners of the world. And the comments below are genuinely one of the best conversations I've ever had the privilege of being part of. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what time it is. Tell me what the show meant to you, if it meant something. And if you enjoyed this journey, if you found yourself wanting to stay with it, if the story felt worth telling and worth listening to, please consider subscribing. It's genuinely free, it genuinely helps the channel do more of this kind of work, and it means the next late-night deep dive can find you wherever you end up watching from. The lights are going down now, the story is told. Family Guy, the real one, the early one. The one that got made by a kid who had been thinking about this stuff since he was old enough to hold a pencil. That show is out there, waiting for whenever you want to go back to it. Sleep well wherever you are. End of script. Uncle Guy lore. Fall asleep to the dark side of Family Guy. Like and subscribe if you want more late-night journeys through the hidden histories of the things we grew up watching. See you in the next one. A note on the show's future. What happens next? A story this long doesn't end cleanly. Family Guy, as of the time this script was written in mid-2026, is still in production. Season 24 premiered in February 2026, continuing the trajectory that the show has been on for years. Consistent production, declining but stable viewership, the enormous accumulated library that generates the licensing and syndication revenue that justifies the machine's continued operation. In April 2025, as mentioned earlier in our journey, the show was renewed through Season 27 by Disney, in what was described as a mega deal that would take the show to the 2028 to 2029 television season and coincide with its 30th anniversary. 30 years. It is genuinely remarkable. Very few television comedies, animated or otherwise, have survived 30 years of continuous production. The Simpsons is the obvious reference, and The Simpsons, in its own way, tells a story not entirely unlike Family Guy's, a story about a brilliant early period and a longer, more complicated later period during which the show continued to exist and continued to have its defenders, even as a critical consensus formed that it had not maintained the quality of its earliest years. Family Guy may ultimately be remembered in similar terms to The Simpsons, as a show with a period of genuine brilliance, a long middle period of inconsistency, and a later period defined more by its commercial persistence than by its creative achievement. Or it may be remembered differently. Television history is long, and the assessments of any individual work in that history shift as time provides perspective that the contemporary moment can't offer. What can be said with confidence from the vantage point of the present is that the show's best work was real and lasting, and that the story of how it got from that work to where it is now is a story worth knowing. Not as a cautionary tale, exactly. The lessons it offers are too specific to the circumstances of one particular show and one particular creator to function as universal principles. But as a record, as a document, as an honest account of what a long creative life in a commercial medium looks like from the inside. The kid from Kent, Connecticut, drawing comics for his local newspaper at 8 years old, is 60 now if you do the math. He has made things that will be watched and discussed long after the specific circumstances of their production have been forgotten. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. The rest, the dark side, the decline, the choices that produce the distance between the early show and the later one, is part of the story too. It always will be. And understanding it, as we have tried to understand it together tonight, is understanding something true about the world in which creative work is made and what happens to it over time. That understanding, arrived at slowly and in the dark, is worth something. It is worth the hours we spent getting here. And now, at last, we can rest.